having made a will for a tramp. The rich man left his wife without an inheritance, and when his mistress got to know about it. That spring the weather was surprisingly sunny and warm. The rays of the sun, getting into the building, as if made the room brighter and cozier. But not the notary's office. At least on this day, the 15 relatives of the recently deceased banker were ready to destroy each other. It was well known to everyone that for many years he had managed to amass a considerable fortune, and everyone thought that it was he who would get the biggest part of the inheritance, as if confirming his right to claim the deceased's wealth. Those gathered took turns trying to remember exactly who he had been, and something of their rare interactions with him. What was Gregory like as a child? A brightly colored lady wiped away a tear, and he and I used to play in the yard almost every day while our mothers sewed something, and they were third cousins, by the way. The man in the cap and time-faded jacket grinned and spoke angrily. You remember, you've never sent a birthday card yourself. Although I did not know him from the nappies, but for the last 15 years I have always sent congratulations on all holidays. And now everyone who sends birthday cards to rich people gets an inheritance, said with contempt the bald gentleman who came out and every minute wiped his head with a handkerchief. All these assembled in anticipation of the inheritance they believed was due. The company was entirely motley. Thus unspokenly they were divided into 3 groups. A well-groomed woman in black, wearing a strict suit and a small hat with a veil, sat aside at the window. Everyone was already aware that this was the main claimant to the banker's wealth, his wife Vivian. A young man of about 25 years of age was seated next to her, stroking the woman's arm soothingly and quietly saying, "Don't worry, everything will be fine." It was clear to everyone without words that these 2 would be the first on the list of applicants for the will. The wife and son of the banker were well known throughout the city, because they regularly appeared on the pages of the local press. The millionaire's wife attended all the boutique openings, festivals, and other glamorous events, and the son spent his parents' money in restaurants, now and then arranging debauches there. There were about 10 people who seemed to have seen each other for the first time, but each of them claimed to be a relative of Gregory who had left this world. They were the ones who were arguing about who, when, and how they had communicated with the deceased and who had more right to be thanked by him. The other 2 in this office were not talking to anyone at all. They sat in silence, watching what was going on. It was a young blonde woman in a small black dress that made her slim and even more attractive. Also sitting there was a man of indeterminate age in an old, rather shabby, but clean suit and a small check. The blonde came in later than the others and looked at the widow defiantly from the doorstep. She grabbed her son's hand and shouted defiantly and loudly, "Why has that creep come? Does she think that my husband will leave a will for a mistress? He had plenty of them." The bald man nervously wiped his head with a handkerchief and quietly said, "Well, knowing how he loved the weaker sex, I'm afraid that if all the mistresses turned up, there would be nothing to catch." The banker was indeed a womanizer, and the pages of the yellow press were full of pictures of him with another young lady. But, it seems, his wife at that moment, everything suited her. After all, she lived in her own pleasure, never working exclusively on her husband's money. Spouse, falling on her son's chest, the widow with all her appearance began to show that she was holding back sobs, although it looked completely implausible. The blonde silently walked to a free table and sat down quite calmly. All the so-called relatives stared at the stranger with disdain, and it seemed that at this moment each of them thought that it was she who could take away their benefits. But in a couple of minutes they all began to recollect again when and how long they had been in touch with the dead man, proving the importance of their relations with him. Only one hobo in a suit watched silently, as if he didn't understand what they were discussing. Several times one of the so-called relatives approached him to find out what exactly he was doing here, but the tramp only shrugged his shoulders in confusion and answered quietly, "I don't know why the notary called me, phoned me, and said that I had to be present at the announcement. It was the banker's will. The brightly painted lady grinned. Well, it seems that our relative is completely out of his mind if he bequeathed something to his mistress and some beggar. Surprisingly, she was interrupted by a man in a cap. You know what, madam, it's not for you to judge Gregory's mental capacity. You see, you're not, I'm sorry, his own sister or mother, are you? Perhaps this chaos would have continued for a long time, but the door opened and a tall, gray-haired man in an obviously expensive suit entered the room, glancing around at everyone gathered. He said that he was a notary and was ready to announce the will of the deceased. There was such silence in the office that if the flies had already woken up on this spring day, one could have heard every flap of their wings. The notary once again looked carefully at everyone and, after a spectacular pause, began to read out the document in the folder opened on the table. And when he stopped talking, the room began to erupt into what seemed like a fight at any moment. The lady with the bright makeup screamed, "Where did you ever see a bum get all the money? And me, even if I'm a distant relative, to get a hand?" She was immediately supported by a bald gentleman. That's right, a bum and a mistress are entitled. And we, who once shared with the deceased in grief and joy, not a penny. Angrily waving his hand, he went to the exit, but the others were not going to disperse humbly. They, as if not realizing that it was impossible to change anything, continued to revolt, demanding justice. The banker had indeed divided everything in a very strange way. The wife got a cottage outside the city, the firm and plus one of the firm's flats to her son, and the mistress a spacious two-room flat in the center. A small sum was signed over to the man in the cap. Apparently there was something between him and the banker for which the latter wanted to thank him. But the last clause of the will, which said that all the funds in the accounts and securities go to no one else than a quietly standing aside tramp, caused a shock to everyone. "What a daddy," said the son indignantly, and looking angrily at his mother added, "And you kept saying that I was his kin. I was a stepson, and I still am." Probably would have written off everything to his kin. The banker's widow, sharply changed in her face, whispered, "What did you want? You were not going to study or work. How many times he offered you to study abroad and help in business?" The widow continued, "So all the girls and clubs were more important to you. All you could do was squander Gregory's money." Michael, that was the young man's name, was indeed not his own son. When Gregory married Vivian, the boy was 10 years old. But from the first day he treated the boy as his own. Except that Michael himself over time grew up and turned into a shameless dependent who did not want to hit his finger on a finger. All his days were scheduled, and in the plans were only meetings with friends and trips to clubs. Nothing else. The widow's remarks to her son were surprisingly interrupted by her mistress. "Stop that noise. Does it bother you at all that we got just some crumbs, and the whole lot went to this tramp? I don't know where he came from." She nodded towards the tramp in the worn jacket and continued, "Personally, I don't understand this situation at all, and I'm not going to put up with it." Everyone immediately turned towards the stranger, and he, not wanting, apparently, to escalate the situation, turned around and, without saying goodbye, quickly went out into the street. There was such hatred in the eyes of those present that it seemed they could tear anyone. But it was not clear to whom this hatred applied more, to the deceased or to the tramp who had received the lion's share of the inheritance. The stranger left, and the people gathered indignantly dispersed for some time. Already in the street, the blonde woman turned to the widow and said, "I don't know about you, but I'm not going to let this go. This tramp will regret that he did not voluntarily give up the wealth that fell on him. It should have gone to us, not that scoundrel, and we must find out where he came from at that moment." The women seemed to have forgotten their personal dislike for each other. What united them now was that they both felt they had been unfairly disadvantaged in the division of the inheritance, and they weren't about to give up so easily. In his heart, Michael was glad that he had got the firm. Gregory bought his stepson's flat a couple of years ago, spacious, with Italian furniture in perfect repair. But having no experience and knowledge in business management, the first thing Michael thought of was to sell the company. The very next day, Michael went to his late stepfather's office to see how much he could make from the business. How disappointed he was when one of the deputies, upon hearing his future plans, grinned sadly and said, "What are you talking about? The firm is on the verge of bankruptcy." Gregory, as soon as he learned that he was ill and would soon die, completely abandoned the business. In fact, let everything go on its own, and in our business you need strict control at all stages. During his illness, many employees, feeling the approaching collapse, resigned, so we have to start almost from scratch. I can, of course, stay on for a while and help you in memory of my father, but you need to invest a lot of money to get the business back on track. Michael was shocked by what he had learned and didn't know what to do next. Of course, he didn't have the necessary funds for development, and it was impossible to sell this sinking ship. He once again hated the tramp, who had obviously got a lot of money and was ready to strangle him with his own hands. At the same time, in a small room in the semi-basement of the lodging house, the tramp was looking at a document with the number of the safe deposit box. Jerome, that was the stranger's name, sat there in disbelief. It all seemed to him like a fiction, a dream. In all his 30-odd years of life, no one had ever given him anything, much less bequeathed it to him. Therefore, he could not fully realize what had happened. The only thing that Jerome understood from the notary was that right today he could go to the bank specified in the will and get a decent amount of money. After a bit of thinking, he went into the big box that replaced his wardrobe and rummaged through his things for a long time. Finally, he found a more or less decent jacket and jeans. It was probably the only thing he could show up at the bank in. At least it seemed that way to Jerome. After quickly changing his clothes and taking the document he had obtained at the notary's office, he went there. The guard at the entrance at first squeamishly examined the entrant and then stepped towards him, saying loudly, "Man, you must have the wrong door. They don't feed you here and they don't give you a living." Jerome, taking out his documents from his inside pocket, timidly said, "I need a director. I'm your client now, and I'd like to get my money." The guard ran his eyes over the presented document in surprise and, turning to his partner, said, "Jen, take him to the manager. I'll alert the secretary." Jerome went up the marble stairs of the bank and once again could not believe that all this was not a dream and was happening to him. A young secretary was already waiting for him in the reception area, and after looking at him from head to toe, she looked questioningly at the guard. The latter, shrugging his shoulders, said, "The orders were to let him through and escort him out. So I did." The girl opened the office door and, entering first, asked, "Daniel, security's here to see you," said to let an important client through. A hoarse voice said something in reply, and the secretary invited Jerome in, then went out and closed the door. Behind the massive desk sat a full gentleman with a red, fleshy face. Jerome was greatly surprised. For some reason, he had expected to see a sporty, trim man, necessarily perfectly dressed in an expensive suit. And that was exactly what he had imagined the bank manager to be. This was the exact opposite. And what's more, the man was clearly hungover. The fat man took a few sips of mineral water from his glass and said unhappily, "Excuse me, I'm very busy. Could you please state your question quickly? Security reported that you are a client of our bank. What can I do for you?" He took another few greedy sips of the liquid, and Jerome thought at that moment that this was the only person who didn't seem to care how or what he was wearing. Jerome stepped to the desk, held out a copy of the will, and said he would like to withdraw half of the amount owed to him. The fat man reread the document, glancing at Jerome incredulously several times and checking his passport. His eyes glittered feverishly. In one gulp he drained the glass, and changing his tone, immediately said good-naturedly, "A pity, a great pity about Gregory. He was a fine man. It's a shame, isn't it? It's strange that the accounts have gone to you and not to your son or wife. Are you a close relative of the deceased?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued excitedly, "Why don't you sit down? Of course, we don't care what you spend your wealth on, but I think we might be able to give you some guidance in these matters. After all, as I understand, you are a newcomer and have not dealt with such sums before, and money should be managed properly." The manager was silent, and as if he was immersed in his own, judging by his face, unhappy thoughts. Jerome could not even think that at that very moment the fat man was thinking how he could make a deal with this tramp in order to win. After all, he needed the money that day. The manager was an inveterate gambler, and the previous night he had lost a considerable sum in an underground establishment. And that was the reason, as usual in such cases, to get drunk right there and then, which now gave him a terrible headache. But despite this, he decided to persuade the client to keep the money. After all, it was his duty to attract new clients, and not to lose those who had kept their capital with them for years. Not yet understanding why, he began to stall and persuade Jerome. "Why take so much at once? You, my dear fellow, have just received your inheritance. Wait, you must get used to the idea that you're rich now. The money will be safe in our bank for the time being, and how will you decide what to spend it on? Welcome. But where are you going with it now, not to bury it in the ground like in the old days?" He tried to laugh at his bad joke, but it obviously didn't work. It was evident that communication was difficult, and he would have been more pleased to improve his health with a drink of something strong than to talk to a tramp. Jerome decided to spare him such agony, and in a confident voice he said, "Please, let's stop this conversation. I, of course, have never had such money, but I already have a clear idea of what I will spend it on. Don't worry, I'll take only half of the money left to me, and the rest will stay in your bank," said Jerome. He really knew what to spend the money on. Since childhood, Jerome had loved animals, especially dogs. So he decided that the first thing he would do was to build a shelter for homeless animals. But he decided not to tell the fat man about it. He was sure that a man like Jerome could not understand him and would take him for a madman. The manager tried once again to stop him, but in the end he was forced to give out part of the deposit. As soon as the door closed behind Jerome, he grabbed the phone and dialed the number with a trembling hand. "Kareem, a man who looks like a vagrant just left my place," the fat man said in a rapid, almost rapid-fire voice. "We need to go and follow him discreetly, where this jerk lives, or where he's going now, and report everything to me." Having hung up the phone, he poured the rest of the mineral water into a glass with a trembling hand and, having drunk it in one gulp, collapsed into the armchair. For a minute, blissfully closing his eyes, he sat there, and then suddenly he grabbed the phone again and, flipping through his notebook, dialed the number. There was no answer for a long time, but as soon as it was answered, the manager spoke in an ingratiating tone. "Michael, hello, it's Daniel. We crossed paths at the club. I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Saved me a couple of times, lent me money to pay off my losses. I'm so sorry about Gregory. It's a real shame." He stopped abruptly, apparently listening to his interlocutor, and then continued. Yes, I know how difficult this is for you. I'm actually shocked by Gregory's will, but there's nothing I can do about it. It's his will. But I wanted to tell you the lucky beneficiary was here today and withdrew half the money. Maybe you'll be interested in that in the near future. I'll know where he went after the bank and maybe even where he lives. Yes, yes, I will be ready to give you this information for a symbolic fee. I named the desired amount. The fat man listened to Michael in silence and promised to call him back as soon as his man returned. Finishing the conversation, he smiled smugly. It's better this way. We'll process this one now, he said aloud and, humming something under his breath, sat down at his computer. Whether it was thoughts of future money or from the huge amount of mineral water he had drunk, but his condition was much better, and he was ready to finally get to work. But just 5 minutes later, he received a phone call. Having quickly written down something on a piece of paper, he, without saying anything, dropped the calling number. He immediately dialed another number. When he heard the answer, he spoke. As promised, I'm ready to give you the address of the newly rich man. I'm sorry, but I'm waiting for a transfer to this phone number first. At the other end, apparently something began to say something indignantly, but the fat man slightly removed the receiver, said loudly, Michael, we're grown-up business people. So, as they say, money in the morning, chairs in the evening. I've been waiting 5 minutes, I'm sorry. I've got a lot on my plate. And as soon as the promised amount is in my account, I'll send you the exact address of this tramp. As he hung up the phone, the manager nervously tapped his pencil on his desk. He kept his eyes on the telephone. When he heard the sound of a message, he smiled and immediately typed a new message to Jerome. At that moment, he had another plan in his mind, which he decided to implement that very day, calling Kareem to him. The manager locked the office from the inside and explained something to him for a long time. He was sure that Michael, having received the address of the tramp, would go there. And he was not mistaken cursing the insolent manager. Michael at that moment drank 2 shots of cognac in a row and called the waiter, paid. He came to this cafe immediately after going to his stepfather's office and with a wild desire to get drunk. The reason for this was, as it turned out, the collapsing, not prosperous business and life injustice. Having been deprived of his much-desired bank account, now having been given the address of the insolent man who had become heir to what should have been his, Michael decided to go and deal with the tramp by hailing a taxi. 20 minutes later, he was standing in front of the 2-story barrack, and after looking round the squalid structure, he went in search of the right room. Approaching the semblance of a front door, Michael said to the plywood scientist, taking hold of the handle, "Hello," and pushed it open. Immediately, the door quietly opened inward. The place he found himself in wasn't very large. 2 huge nails were hammered into the wall by the door, probably instead of hangers, and some things were hanging on them. The daylight hardly penetrated the room. The window was very small and somewhere below the ceiling, which made the room seem gloomy and damp. The only furniture in the room was a bed made of wooden sticks, a shabby table with paint splatters, and a single stool on which the tramp sat. There was a metal mug of hot tea on the table in front of him, and a long loaf in his hand. Michael looked at it squeamishly and said with a chuckle, "I never thought that the heir to such money lives in a shanty town and eats a loaf with some bologna. For your stepfather's money you could eat black caviar with spoons and drink expensive cognac." When he noticed a small black bag on the table, he staggered towards it. Jerome, obviously not expecting guests, had not had time to put it away after his return from the bank, and it was in it that he had brought the withdrawn sum. He stood up abruptly and took the bag off the table and set it beside him. Michael grinned and said angrily, "Look, where did you come from? Everything was supposed to go to me and only me. Do you realize it's not yours? You'd better give it to me nicely." To which Jerome calmly replied, "It's not for us to decide. It was the dead man's will. So the money is mine now." The guest's patience ran out at once, and he staggered towards his host, saying, "I will beat you now, so that you will beg me to take it all back, and I will first beat your face slowly and surely." He had already made a clenched fist when he found himself lying on the floor with his hand behind his back. Jerome was clearly enunciating the words. 2 hours a week in the gym is not enough time to think you're the master of the world. You know what Special Forces is? Maybe you've heard of it. I spent 2 years there bleeding and sweating. I wouldn't advise you to continue our conversation in such a tone. And you, sir, better go home and sleep it off. Taking Michael by the shoulders with both hands, he sharply put him on his feet. Where's the door, remember? Good luck. Returning to the table, he sat down on a chair and had already taken a mug in his hands, when the guest from the doorway shouted, "Yes, I'll destroy you. You bring me that money yourself on a tray. You'll see." Jerome rose sharply from his chair, but the furious major had already left, slamming the door. That evening, the owner of the wealth that had fallen from the sky could not sleep for a long time. And it was not even in the appearance with the scandal Michael, but in the fact that he himself was trying to understand what had happened. But by morning, Jerome calmed down and already clearly decided that the next day he would start to find out what was necessary to open the orphanage. In the morning, he went to all the authorities, then looked for a place for the pets to live, and came back in the evening, tired, but very satisfied with the work he had done. Everything was working out just fine. In a week or two, he could be the owner of a small shelter for homeless animals. Jerome decided to have dinner and go to bed early so that the next day he could finish all the necessary paperwork. In the morning, he got up in high spirits and hastily brewed himself a cup of coffee, drinking it without breakfast. He was about to leave. When there was a knock at the door, Jerome thought it was Michael again, but he dismissed the thought. Surely he wouldn't behave so decently, and he would have burst in without knocking and opened the door like last time. He was surprised. On the threshold stood 2 men, one of whom, taking his ID out of his pocket, said they were police officers. He reported. Early last morning, Michael's body was found in the archway outside your house. The lad has a head injury and is in intensive care. A second authority spokesman added. We have interviewed residents and several people said he was coming out of your driveway, and an upstairs neighbor says you had some sort of scandal that evening. We have already found out that you had grounds, because you suddenly inherited what should have legally gone to this young man. Get yourselves together. We must detain you until the circumstances are clarified. Jerome tried to justify himself. Yes, we had a fight, but I would never do such a thing in my life. Do I have an alibi or witnesses? Who can confirm that you didn't follow him? Asked one of the policemen, and, without waiting for an answer, added, Pack up, we're waiting for you. We're going to the station. Jerome thought about what had happened. He didn't understand who would want to attack Michael, but somehow he was sure that it was all connected with the inheritance. During the interrogation, he tried to remember all the details and tell everything to the investigator, hoping that he would be able to understand the case. Jerome realized that he had been set up. But who had done it? He knew neither the spouse nor the mistresses of the deceased, who wanted to get the inheritance, certainly would not dare to do such a thing, and no one else came to his mind. At the end of the interrogation, the young investigator said, I will of course look into everything, but I must say, the victim's mother is determined and said she would make every effort to bring the case to court. Once in the detention center, Jerome couldn't stop thinking about who had benefited from the attack and who else would want to eliminate him by taking him into custody. But nothing good came to his mind. Realizing that it would be virtually impossible to prove his innocence, he almost resigned himself to the fact that he would have to serve time. That all changed one day when the cell door opened and he was told that he had a visitor. Jerome was surprised, of course, but he had no idea who he would see there. Standing before him was the same mistress of the deceased whom he had seen at the notary's office, wearing a delicate pink trouser suit and high heels. She was even more beautiful than she had been that day at the notary's office. Her blonde curls fell over her shoulders. Her face was covered with a minimum of makeup, and Jerome stood staring at her beauty. The girl grinned. Well, what are you up to? We don't have much time, so I'll get straight to the point. I know you're being accused of something you didn't do, and I have evidence on who is really guilty of what happened. But you realize I'm not just going to hand it over. Jerome sat down opposite and continued to stare at his interlocutor. She said, I am ready even now to give everything I have, and the guilty will be put in jail, but you, of course, will be released. But you see, nothing in life happens for nothing. You give me everything Gregory bequeathed you, and I'll give the investigator the dirt. Jerome thought for a while, but he answered, I agree. You know, freedom is more precious than any riches. Grinning sadly, he added, all the more so. I didn't even have time to smell that money. As they say, if you haven't lived richly, there's no reason to start. I think such a pretty girl will need this dowry more. Looking at the blonde, he realized that she was not ready for such a turn. No, she might have believed it, but that Jerome would refuse so quickly certainly did not expect. But then she pulled herself together and said, well, that's fine. But you know, I need a guarantee, a receipt, or a power of attorney of some kind. And as they say, go on, Henry. He smiled. Not Henry, Jerome, but you're a savior. What's your name? But the blonde silently pulled a sheet and pen from her small purse, placing them on the table in front of Jerome. He wrote, she prompted, dictated, and when he finished, she reread it. Then she smiled. Good boy, no fool. You'd be more decent, not a tramp. Maybe she'd even fall in love. Already approaching the door, she turned round and, smiling, said, by the way, my name is Lauren. Good luck. Jerome waved picturesquely. She left, and when he was in the cell, he realized that he really liked the girl. At the notary's office, he had no time for that. He had been confused, so he hadn't been paying attention to anything. And now, when she came to him in the detention center, the rest of the day Jerome only thought about her. But at some point he realized that nothing could be between them, forbade himself to think about the blonde. To say that he immediately believed that, having received the money, she would bring the matter to an end. Jerome couldn't believe it. But Lauren did hand over some, apparently material from the cameras to the investigators, and the next day he was free. If only he could have known that this particular hottie had a hand in his imprisonment. Lauren, as promised when leaving the notary's office, didn't leave the case alone. She couldn't bear to see some half-bum become rich. Annie, who had possessed the banker's data of late, left nothing to it, having reported to the bank almost immediately after Jerome. Annie, who knew the manager's weakness for money, suggested to him a very favorable plan. It was simply to take the money from the tramp by any means necessary, and then divide it between the two. And it was the fat man who told her that he had given Michael the address of the newly made heir, and that he had been drinking a lot and was probably going there at that moment. Together they thought out everything to the last detail, and in a few hours the hired scoundrels caught up Michael and beat him up. Everything else went according to plan, and after getting a power of attorney from Jerome, they split everything in half the same day. But Jerome didn't know anything about it, and when he was released, he was glad that he wouldn't have to spend the next few years behind bars. As he approached the door of his home, he saw a small shaggy lump right on the threshold. It turned out to be a puppy of a completely unknown breed, black in color with white spots on its chest and legs. He looked frightened with his little button eyes, begging Jerome not to leave him. Poor fellow, where did you come from? And how long have you been sitting here? Hungry, I suppose. Saying this, he lifted the baby in his arms and carried him home to the trough where he usually washed. Jerome himself found a tin of stew on the windowsill and, opening it, said, Well, Black, that's our supper for tonight. Come on, join us. And at night Jerome slept as if he had fallen into a dreamless pit until morning, and the baby snuggled against his legs and only occasionally sighed, as if reliving his feelings and problems. In the morning, Jerome woke up and was glad to be free. And probably even more so that now he had nothing to do with this crazy family, deciding that everything was in the past. Jerome started to get ready to go again, looking for some temporary part-time work, which he had existed before he got his inheritance. He helped unload cars at the market, cleaned the supermarket grounds for a small fee, and it was just enough for the essentials. After patting Black behind the ear, he was about to leave when there was a knock at the door. After the police had knocked on his door the same way this morning, he didn't expect anything good to come of such a knock. As he approached the door, Jerome stood for a second and pulled it open. He couldn't believe his eyes. Michael's mother stood on the doorstep, the same widow who had been at the reading of the will. Seeing his surprised face, Mrs. Elizabeth said quietly, "Hello, may I come in? I really need to talk to you." Jerome took a step back, letting her pass, and suddenly quickly took his jacket off the nail and laid it on a chair, inviting his guest to sit down. She looked round the poor dwelling fearfully and looked at Jerome, but sat down, deciding that she, too, wanted the money he had inherited. He decided to make it clear at once, and seating himself on a plastic crate that stood against the wall, said defiantly, "If you're after your husband's $1 million, I don't have it anymore." His mistress turned out to be nimble and is probably already somewhere on the sea spending what she got in exchange for my freedom. I gave her everything. The woman looked up at him, her eyes full of tears, and he realized that that was not what she had come for. As a lump rose in her throat, she spoke softly. "When my husband was alive, he solved every problem. My son and I lived without any problems, without any troubles or worries, but now he's gone. My son is in a coma. I am all alone, and there is no one to help me. My friends are like, if you've got money, they're there for you. If there's no money, they're gone. My son needs expensive treatment, then recovery. Of course, I have some money, but it's running out like water. I didn't come here to ask for money. I already know that bitch Laurent took it from you." Standing up, she went to Jerome, who was sitting silent, and with a pleading tone in her voice, she begged, "I'm begging you to take over the firm. Well, at least until Michael will not recover. After all, we are our own people. I do not know for what reason, but the same heir as me and my son." Jerome was shocked at the suggestion. "Do you think you're saying I'm the one to run the business? I've never done anything like that in my life. I have a secondary education specialized, and here finances, transactions, something else there." She, as if trying to calm him down, started talking again. "It's nothing complicated, nothing. The firm has been around for years. You just look after the cogs of this machine, which is already working on the beaten track. You just have to feel a man's hand there. So I want you to be that hand." The widow was so sincere that Jerome felt sorry for her. She seemed unhappy and confused, and he promised to think about it, and the next day he agreed. Mrs. Elizabeth was glad of the decision. She managed to get it all over to Jerome very quickly, and he had no idea at that moment what kind of bondage he was getting into. He was so open, so trusting, that life didn't seem to have taught him anything. Once again he believed, not suspecting that the widow had already thought of everything in advance. She had made such an offer for a reason. Having learnt that the company is on the verge of bankruptcy and up to her ears in debt, the woman decided to switch it all to the hated tramp. On the first day, finding himself in a half-empty office, Jerome learnt all, from the same Deputy Gregory, the real picture of affairs. It was only then that he realized what he had agreed to get himself into. All day he sat in his office, poring over some papers and documents on his desk, understanding nothing about them. He didn't know what to do with all this, how to proceed. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet voice. "Excuse me, can I clean your place?" Looking up, Jerome saw a young, pretty girl of about 25 with a bucket and a mop in her hands. He nodded, and rising from his chair, caught a stack of some documents, which immediately scattered on the floor. The cleaning lady dropped her equipment and began to help him pick up the papers. After a glimpse of a few sheets, she suddenly said, "You know, these contracts need to be renegotiated. They're flawed and therefore inherently unprofitable for the company." Jerome raised his eyes to her and looked at her carefully, asking, "How do you know? Do you work it out?" He motioned for her to sit down, and they chatted for a very long time. Jerome learnt that her name was Catherine. It turned out that the girl had a degree in economics, but because of once made a rash mistake could not find a job in her specialty. "My former manager offered me to become his mistress," she said sadly. "And when I refused, he framed me, forged a signature on a document. It all ended with a suspended sentence. With such a stigma, as you understand, no one takes a job. So I have to be a cleaner. I've got a little boy, Nicholas." Not expecting himself, Jerome suddenly asked, "What about your husband? Doesn't he work?" She grinned and said quietly, "Husband, as they say, is full of pears. I've been divorced for over 2 years now. I don't even know where this scoundrel is. He's never once come to see his son. Speaking of you, I overheard a conversation. I won't say whose, I'm sorry. Well, they're trying to set you up with all the debts of this office. But if you'll excuse me, when I'm done cleaning, I can take a look. Maybe there's something else I can fix." Well, it can't be that such a well-known company in the whole region so easily and quickly collapsed. Jerome took her hand and said with a smile, "Yes, you, Catherine. It seems to me God himself sent me. How could I be against it? I even thank you for it. Help me." And she really got to work. They sat up till almost midnight, going over the papers. When the clock struck 1:30, Jerome said, "Catherine, that's enough for today. Let me walk you out. My son must have missed his mum by now. Tomorrow, if you don't mind, I'll be waiting for you here again. We have a chance to save the firm." Catherine smiled and said, "There is always a chance. The main thing is to know how to use it. Mrs. Vivian, the pensioner who lives next door, is helping me with my son. I phoned her. Everything's fine. She agreed to babysit while I'm in the office and put him to bed." From that day on, Jerome ran the company, or rather Catherine did. But nominally he was the director, no matter how hard it was. But she had time to fulfill her direct duties, clean the office, and all the documents to review, and with her son to deal with. Jerome was amazed at how much strength and energy this fragile woman had. He realized that if it wasn't for her, the company would have collapsed, and was very grateful for the help. Catherine in a short time managed to review all the contracts already concluded, and what could be changed or corrected changed. But that wasn't all. She found new profitable clients and helped Jerome to conclude several deals that gave the firm a chance for a second breath. Slowly, employees who had quit began to return. And after Gregory's death, the firm began to pick up again. All this time, despite the problems that fell on him, Jerome did not forget that he really wanted to know the reason why the late businessman left him an inheritance. It was obviously for a reason. And perhaps he was a relative of Gregory's in some way. But did I know my kin? He was about 2 years old when he went to the orphanage, and all the way through the army. It was his only family of origin. Some of the nannies said that he was thrown under the door, and some said that his parents were killed in an accident. And after that he was placed in an orphanage. But he never knew the whole truth. After a little bit of sorting things out, Jerome was still going to go to the orphanage, where he grew up, and try to find out the truth. At the first attempt, nothing came out. No one wanted to talk, but Jerome felt that the director was not telling him something. He had been told from the time he lived there that the headmistress had a taste for money and would take bribes at any opportunity. He went there again the next day. When she saw the envelope in Jerome's hands, she quickly became talkative and told him everything she knew. It turned out that Jerome was Gregory's own son. He had actually had his wife killed in an accident many years ago. Gregory was just developing as a businessman, and his competitors were giving him a hard time. There were constant threats, demands to sell the firm. And Gregory, terrified for his child's life, decided to give him to an orphanage. It was too late for Jerome to find out. I wanted to ask why he did not take him away when everything became calm. But alas, there was no one to ask. It came as a shock to Jerome. It turned out that all these years he lived in the same city with his own father without even knowing it. When Jerome left the orphanage, the carers had tears flowing. He had dreamed all the years since he was a child that he would have his own people, his mom and dad. And now, learning there was a father, he couldn't contain his emotions. Jerome had only seen Gregory in a portrait with a mourning ribbon in his office. But on this night he dreamed of him as if he were alive. His father begged his forgiveness, begged him not to abandon his life's work, to save the firm. Waking up in the morning, Jerome gave himself a promise to do everything in his power to avoid bankruptcy and bring the company to the next level. The black dog that ran up, as if approving his thoughts, barked merrily and wagging his tail, curled up at his feet. "Well, little one, don't worry, everything will be fine. Soon we'll move with you to a normal house, and you'll live like a noble dog, Bones." "Goodies," Jerome said. Indeed, as soon as the firm's business got better, he began to look for a place to rent and finally move out of this shack. The business, thanks to Catherine's help, began to return to its former successful level. The staff was great, and everyone took the changes from the new manager surprisingly well. Jerome watched Catherine work hard for a while, and one day, taking her by the hand, he said, "Now then, I've made up my mind. Such a bright head should not be lost cleaning the office. You're a real professional, and that's why I'm appointing you CFO from today. I hope you don't mind." The previous CFO never returned, although he had received calls offering him a job. "So, Catherine, your office is now across the door from mine, please." "No, I even demand that you go and settle in right now," Jerome said. Catherine looked at him confused and as if afraid to move. Jerome, seeing her condition, put his arm around her shoulders and quietly said, "What's the matter with you? You deserve it. Let's celebrate your appointment tonight at a cafe. I hope you can ask your neighbor to be with Nicholas." The evening went splendidly. Jerome found a quiet, cozy establishment, and they had a wonderful time there, talking about completely different topics. It was so easy for the two of them, as if they had known each other all their lives. When they left the cafe, Jerome suddenly stopped and pulled Catherine to himself, kissed her. For about 5 minutes they stood embraced, and both of them absolutely did not want to part. "Let's walk a little more," Jerome suggested in a whisper, and Catherine agreed. Holding hands, they walked along the seafront. They wandered for an hour, gazing at the stars and the water. It was there that Jerome decided that he wanted to fall asleep and wake up with Catherine every day. But it was clear that there was no way he could bring her to his current place. After seeing her home that evening, he decided to take care of the housing issue the very next day. A day later, when he looked into her office, he said cryptically, "Catherine, I want to take you to lunch. I want to show you something. I hope you don't mind." When they entered the spacious two-bedroom just across the street from the office, nicely renovated and furnished, he put his arm around her and quietly asked, "Do you like it, Catherine? I've found a small but cozy nest. I want you and Nicholas to move in with me." She smiled happily. "Let's give it a try." A few days later, as they were loading Catherine and her son's belongings into the car, the very neighbor who had been looking after the boy came over. And with tears in her eyes, the neighbor said, "Oh, what am I going to do without you now? Nicholas is like a grandson to me." Jerome approached his grandmother and, smiling, said, "So Catherine and I are going to another city. If you don't mind, until we get Nicholas into daycare, you can keep an eye on him. I'll send a car for you in the morning. And of course we'll take you back too, and will you and Nicholas stay with us? Well, play here, read to him. What else? And we'll pay you a salary like a nanny. Unless, of course, you ask for $1 million," Jerome laughed with a wink. And the grandmother, immediately frightened, replied, "What's the matter with you? What money? I tell you, Nicholas is like a grandchild to me." "Well, that's fine," Jerome said with a look at Catherine. "So tomorrow morning at about 8 o'clock a driver will come to pick you up." Jerome was himself surprised at how easily he was now able to enjoy the benefits he was entitled to. The company was doing very well, and he could afford a rented but good apartment, a company car with a driver. But most importantly, he was happy with Catherine and had quickly found common ground with Nicholas. Now he had somewhere to go and wanted to go home. Catherine turned out to be a wonderful hostess, very tasty cooked, trying to spoil them almost every day with some goodies. Life seemed to be getting better. Jerome gradually began to get into all the affairs of the company, and he even found it very interesting. During the whole time, he only once remembered about those, thanks to whom he got this business. And that was only because Mrs. Elizabeth herself showed up at the office. Honestly, I never understood why she was there. Well, okay, I saw a look of annoyance or regret on her face. She clearly didn't expect to see a fully functioning company and a full staff. After sitting for half an hour or so, Mrs. Elizabeth tried to complain about life, telling me how hard it was for her son and her without a livelihood. Then suddenly she said, "Michael," as soon as he regained consciousness, remembered that the bank manager who gave your address was literally half an hour afterwards finding out where Michael was. There's a reason for that. I think he was the one who ordered my son to the gangsters," Mrs. Elizabeth said. "Have you reported this to the police?" Jerome asked. "You need to make sure you tell them all of this. If anything is required of me, I am willing to testify or help. Be sure to tell everything to the coroner." As he saw the widow off, he didn't even realize that the whole inheritance story didn't end there. Some time later, he was indeed called for questioning, but already as a victim. It turned out that Michael still wrote a statement. He told everything he remembered, and his bank manager was taken into custody. The fat man turned out to be a coward, ratted out everyone involved in the case. The investigation went on for a long time and was quite high profile. The manager of a well-known financial institution in the city turned out to be a common bandit. Laurent managed to somehow get out of it and, as they say, got off with a slight fright, unlike the fat man, who with all his accomplices went to jail. All the funds stolen from the account bequeathed to Jerome were returned. Not thinking long, he made a decision: half will keep to buy his own home and business development, and the other half immediately transferred to the account opened for Michael. Jerome told him about it right in the hospital, where he came to tell him who he was and why he got such a large inheritance. Upon hearing this, Michael said quite calmly, "So, now you're like a brother to me. I've dreamed of having an older brother all my life." They both smiled and agreed that they would never fight again, no matter what happened. From that moment on, surprisingly, Michael went on the mend rather quickly. And a month later, when he was discharged, Jerome said sternly, "I'll give you 2 weeks to recover, and I'll see you back at the office. You'll be working for me. Daniel is going somewhere else in another city to live. There you'll be my new deputy," Jerome said. From Michael's happy face, he immediately realized that he wouldn't refuse and began to gradually bring him up to speed. When Michael went to work, Jerome breathed a sigh of relief. "Well, now that I have such a reliable cover, I can safely take care of my personal life." Walking over to Catherine, who was sitting at her laptop, He pulled a small velvet box out of his pocket. "Catherine, will you be my wife? I love you and Nicholas very much, and I want to be with you always." She stood up, put her arms around his neck, and said quietly, "I love you too. And I agree. After all, our son or daughter should definitely have a daddy." Pulling away for a second, Jerome looked at her with loving eyes and grabbed her in his arms and whirled her around the office. "Hey, hello. Am I disturbing you?" Laughing, Michael watched the scene. "Are you inviting me to the wedding?" said Michael. Setting his favorite on the table, he turned round and replied cheerfully, "You what? You're going to be the most important person after us at this celebration. You're going to go as a witness." A month later, in the same cozy cafe, where not so long ago first sat Jerome and Catherine, the wedding was celebrated. The newlyweds, smiling happily, kissed under the shouts of bitterly of the guests and accepted congratulations. Nicholas, not yet understanding anything, sat in the arms of his favorite nanny and clapped his hands joyfully. Mrs. Elizabeth, rubbing in her hands the ribbon of the witness on the stage, whispered and asked, "When are you getting married, Michael? It's time for me to babysit my grandchildren too." Hearing this, Jerome decided to intercede. He's going to have a good time until he meets the one he really loves. And if you want grandchildren, you can come and babysit for us. We'll soon have 2 little ones who need love and attention. Suddenly, Nicholas jumped into the conversation. "We also have a dog called Black. He needs to be walked. That's what Daddy says." Everyone laughed, and Jerome gently pressed Catherine against him. "I'm the luckiest man in the world," he whispered. Then, pausing and catching the moment before anyone was paying attention to them, he said, "I've also decided to give you a wedding present. Yesterday you got your suspended criminal record expunged. Turns out there's a great lawyer who managed to prove pretty quickly that you're innocent. So now you have nothing to be embarrassed or afraid of. But I hope you won't quit." Having learnt this, Catherine, barely holding back her tears, happily dissolved into the arms of her spouse. Vanessa was on her way to her mother Jessica's hospital. On the way, she was leafing through a fashion magazine she found on a bench at the bus stop. Rich, beautiful, and successful models with perfect makeup and hairstyles, dressed in clothes of famous brands, looked at the girl from the pages. Their beauty was so bright, so perfect, that Vanessa did not even think of envy. It didn't occur to her that she could look good in expensive clothes after a visit to the salon. There was no room for anything expensive in her and her mother's quiet and modest life. Her mother had worked as a nurse in a polyclinic all her life, with occasional part-time jobs as an orderly and cleaner. Vanessa tried to help her as much as possible. The girl never asked about her father. Only once her mother misspoke, saying that people like him would never get in touch with people like them. What did she mean, and what hidden meaning did she put in that phrase? It remained a mystery to Vanessa. In her earliest childhood, the girl had been terribly curious to know who her daddy was. She didn't dare to ask about him as a child, so she could fantasize about him as much as she wanted. The fact that he was not written in her birth documents added even more mystery to him. The girl grew up, and with her grew the role of her father in her fantasies. In time, she began to imagine that he spent his life performing important and dangerous tasks. He was strictly forbidden to disclose the family. That's why she and her mom lived in this tiny, forgotten town. Living in it, it was absolutely impossible to believe that some 200 kilometers away was the brilliant city of New York, in which life was boiling and beating key. And their life didn't even flow, it barely ebbed and flowed, finding its way among the eternal busyness of the mother and the quiet, imperceptible hobbies of the daughter. Vanessa herself didn't remember at what point she started writing down her thoughts, dreams about her father, and life stories. By the time she reached the age of consciousness, she had accumulated so many such records that it would be enough for a small book. Going through the records, the girl acquired her first dream to publish a book and become a writer in that order. After all, she needed the approval of her readers to continue. For now, only 2 obstacles separated her from the moment when the manuscript would see the light of day: money and fear. Fear that her work would not be appreciated. Are you kidding me? Vanessa couldn't say she was unhappy. Mom Jessica, despite the busyness and complete lack of money, always tried to pay attention to her daughter, to please, hug, and cheer up. The girl grew up in love and therefore not so acutely felt the lack of some things: fashionable clothes, expensive toys, and sweets. Every weekend, Mom took the girl by the hand and they went to the park or the forest to walk, get acquainted with nature, feed ducks or fish. Once in class, answering the teacher's question, how she knows so much about animals, plants, nature, the girl told about their little tradition with her mother. So she, without wanting to, and without knowing it, made her first enemy a classmate, Kiara. Kiara grew up in a rich family, but she saw no love, no attention, no care. Expensive toys could not replace parents. Fancy clothes, lively communication, and gadgets, family warmth. The fact that Vanessa possessed all of these things, and therefore bypassed her, ignited an envy in Kiara that quickly turned to hatred. Thoughts jumped around in the girl's head like hairs from one memory to another. Apparently she was ready to think about anything but the fact that the bus would stop at the end of the ride. Vanessa would get off at the final stop and go to the hospital. There for the second week, her mom was in the hospital with no hope of recovery. The doctor repeatedly offered to discharge her home, to live with her family and friends. Vanessa refused. For Jessica's mom, she was the only family and friends she had. But there was no strength to support her mom at all. They were barely enough to drive to her mom's house every day, bring home cooked meals, and stay cheerful. Returning home, she would close the door and slowly slump down on it, biting her lip in pain. The nearest, dearest, and only dear person in her life was leaving. There was nothing she could do about it. One of the orderlies hinted for the girl to start preparing. For what? Vanessa clapped her eyes in bewilderment, not really understanding what she was talking about. And she did. For what? Not for the discharge, for the funeral. What funeral? What are you talking about? Mom will recover and will live like we used to. We'd like that to happen, but this disease doesn't give us a chance. You're wrong. You're wrong. Mom's strong, she'll be fine. Besides, the doctor offered to discharge her. Yes, to live to avoid spending state funds. The woman grinned loudly. Here, Derivianko, take this and you'll need it. And she handed Vanessa neatly folded bills. No need, we don't need anything. The catchphrase of all those who really need everything. Maybe not you, but you should see your mother off. I'll tell you everything in order tomorrow, or you'll forget something. I told you, you don't have to teach me anything or explain anything. Mom and I are fine. Only 5 days later, Vanessa sobbed in the arms of the same nurse, unable to accept the fact that she was all alone in the world. The old woman stroked her head and quietly repeated that everything would be all right, that Mom was now in a better world, she was not hurt or scared there. And Vanessa thought how scary it is when there are no close and dear people. Not at all. This nurse will wait for the girl to calm down and go about her business. And in a couple of days, she'll forget about Vanessa and her grief. And Vanessa will stay and continue to live in a world where no one is interested in how she is and how she feels. Suddenly, the nurse said a phrase that, in fact, turned the girl's consciousness upside down and subsequently completely changed her life. And cry now, you and your mother to bury, and father to support. Men bear grief worse, said the nurse. I've never seen yours. When she realized that she had said something wrong, the woman continued. Do you have one? Your father? No, and never had one, Vanessa answered. How come? I don't know. I've never seen him. My mom never told me. But any other relatives? No one. Mom was the only one. It's impossible for a man to be alone. If your parents broke up when you were young, foolishly, and then your pride didn't allow you to reconcile, and your father lives somewhere, does not know that he has a beautiful daughter, then Vanessa did not pay attention to the words of a kind woman, who, by the way, really helped the girl with the organization of the funeral, advised and prompted how and what should be done. Without her, Vanessa would not have done even half of what she had to do. In the evening after the funeral, Vanessa remembered the nurse's words, except to say search, and it's easy. And where to begin the search, thought the girl, absolutely no idea. And she decided to start with taking apart her mother's archive, a massive old dresser filled with various useful and useless but memorable things. Several drawers were occupied by Vanessa's mother's document school, leaving certificates, diplomas, letters, and photos. As a child, the girl often went through them in search of something interesting. Then she didn't pay much attention to old photographs and letters, half of which she couldn't even read because of illegible handwriting. Today she wanted to study everything thoroughly. Among the papers she found the deeds to the apartment. It turned out that the apartment had belonged to her for many years. A deed of gift had been made in her name, but the name of the donor was unfamiliar to Vanessa, and the date was approximately the same as the date of birth of the girl. After spending the night without sleep, trying to make sense of everything that was stored in her mother's dresser, by morning Vanessa was forced to admit that she had learned nothing new. The letters stored were from her parents' girlfriends. Vanessa knew Mom's parents had left this world long before she came along. Mom had been in medical school then. Barely self-sufficient, she was left alone. Then she'd found support in friends and a certain David. Vanessa was interested in the mention of the young man, but he was only mentioned a couple of times. Not enough for the man who later became the father of her child. And the references were odd. David brought her, drove her, helped her. It was like she wasn't talking about her lover, but a longshoreman. Unpacking the largest box of letters, the girl at the bottom found a postcard from a Black Sea resort. Strange, Vanessa said to herself. Mom never said she had been to the sea. The postcard was addressed to her parents. It said that the girl was doing well and the vacation was going well. Well, it turns out Mom had a busy life, and I saw her always busy, tired, running from one job to another, thought Vanessa. In another box, as if to confirm her thoughts, Vanessa found a photo of her mother from the seashore. She was looking at her as a young girl, no more than 20 years old. She was smiling radiantly, hugging the young man around the waist. The problem was that the young man himself was mercilessly torn from the photo. Neither his face nor even his height could be determined. So interesting, Vanessa said. So Mom went on vacation with a certain young man, probably, most likely, my father. Apparently their relationship didn't work out with my mom. She threw his picture away and never told me anything. After rummaging through the rest of the papers, hoping to find the second part of the photo, Vanessa had to give up. Dawn was dawning outside the window. She began to drift off to sleep. In her dream, she saw her mother young and cheerful again. She was running along the edge of the sea and laughing. A young man was following her with big steps. He opened his arms, trying to catch the girl in his arms, but each time she managed to slip out of his reach. Vanessa tried to see the young man's face, but it kept dissolving in the glare of the sun. Vanessa awoke just before noon. The June sun was shining brightly outside the window. She had to decide how to live in general and what to do today in particular. She decided to start by tidying up the apartment to take her mind off things. But even while she was busy with her physical work, she couldn't stop thinking about how to move on. Vanessa had a brilliant ninth grade school certificate and a red diploma from the teacher's college she had entered after a classmate, Chiara, had made her stay at school unbearable. Vanessa could not understand when she crossed the road daughter of rich parents and what earned her hatred. Just one day the girl hated her a quiet, unremarkable, excellent student who never said a word against anyone. Chiara turned out to be very persistent and inventive in terms of mischief. In just 3 years, she had developed such an active activity to turn Vanessa's life into a nightmare that the famous quiet girl had no choice but to look for a suitable school and transfer. It was pointless to change schools. Chiara had acquaintances everywhere. So Vanessa, at the age of 18, was almost a specialist. However, she did not have time to rejoice in her diploma. The departure of her mother made all the joys dim and insignificant. For a whole week, Vanessa tried to find a job by specialty in schools and kindergartens. It turned out that no one needed young specialists with a great desire to work, but a complete lack of experience. The money, which after the funeral was left very little, quickly ran out, and Vanessa had to sharply lower the bar of requirements for work. Now she was happy to take any position as long as she could get money for food. She posted her resume everywhere she could, but no one was willing to hire her. Finally, late one night, the phone rang. "Vanessa, good afternoon. You placed an ad for a job. Is it still up to date?" asked on the other end of the line. "Yes, of course," replied the girl, practically jumping with joy with the receiver in her hands. "Are you not embarrassed by the offer to work as a maid?" "No, I'm ready for any kind of work now." "Great. Then they'll be expecting you tomorrow. I'll text you the address. Try to be there no later than 10. The personnel manager is a finicky man. He doesn't like to be late," the phone said. "By the way, are you ready to move to the employer's house?" "Yes, I guess I'm ready." "Where does he live?" "Staten Island." "In principle, you can come from home, but we have situations when you need to stay longer or get up early." "Where is Staten Island?" "I don't know," Vanessa admitted, who had never left her hometown. "Staten Island is a borough of New York City. That's the city you listed on your resume." Vanessa remembered that she had actually written that in a few sentences, not really hoping for a response. "I probably won't make it by 10 tomorrow. I live in another city." "Which one?" asked on the other end of the line. Having heard the answer, the interlocutor didn't seem to be surprised. "In the morning, you will take the train from your city. It leaves at 6, and you will be met at the station. If you are ready to work, pack everything you need at once." "What exactly would I need to be a maid?" Vanessa asked. Ahead, at least, the caller grinned and hung up. Vanessa sat down on the floor, puzzled. The offer was as unexpected and mysterious as possible. They were ready to send an automobile to the train for the maid. She was so surprised by this offer that she forgot to ask about salary and working conditions. And what was the point of these questions? After all, the girl had never worked. She did not even have a labor book. Besides, the money was enough only for a ticket. "Well, it's not much of a choice to starve here for another week, or to take a risk and go to work in the city of dreams. I think the decision is obvious. I'm going," the girl said to herself and went to pack her things. Vanessa, who had never left the city, was faced with a very difficult choice. But what to take with her on the trip? What would come in handy for work? How would she leave the apartment? With the apartment account, the solution was obvious: give the keys to her neighbor to keep an eye on her. Late one night, Vanessa knocked on the neighbor's door. "Jessica, could you help me out?" she asked. "Yes, Vanessa, what's wrong? What are you doing up so late?" "I already went to bed," the neighbor replied. Vanessa knew perfectly well that the neighbor was lying. No one knew when she slept or if she slept at all. She was awake at all hours of the day and always saw and heard everything. She was aware of every incident, every gossip, every scandal. Jessica, I have to leave early tomorrow morning. I'll leave the spare keys. You keep an eye on the apartment, Vanessa said. Where do you think you're going? The girl's first impulse was to keep silent. After all, tomorrow not only the whole entrance, but the whole city will know about her plans, if anyone in the city is even interested in her modest person. However, having judiciously reasoned that to go to an unknown place, without warning anyone, is definitely not worth it, she replied. I'm going to New York to get a job. We couldn't find anything here. We need something to live on. Are you going to look for your father? The woman asked in a bizarre way. Who? You know, my father. I thought he was from New York. How do you even know about my father? My mom never told me anything about him. There was nothing to tell. They didn't even get to know each other before she got pregnant and he ran away from her. How do you know that? We moved into this apartment when I was born. The woman hesitated. It was obvious that she was trying to find the words to answer. Well, people said that you were born to some important man. That's the apartment your mother was given. But your parents didn't have anything serious. I don't know anything else. Don't ask. You know me. I've got no bones in my mouth. What I would have known, I would have told you, the old woman said, as Vanessa prepared to ask more. I'm going to apply for a job as a maid in the house of some wealthy man. I'll write to you as soon as I'm settled. Of course you will. What if they take away your passport and take you where? To the border? Vanessa was surprised. You may be quiet, but you're a good-looking girl. Jessica, don't worry. They won't like someone like me, she shook her head. Well, you shouldn't be like that. Your mother, she was the same. All her life, Vanessa considered herself unworthy of relationships. Everyone was ashamed that she was raised by her mother without a husband. And the guys who were chasing her long ago, maybe they could have lifted her out of poverty. She'd be alive now. I feel sorry for Vanessa. The old woman really well treated the young, quiet neighbor, who alone tried to raise her daughter, Kiara. It was a shame that she, having lived such a hard life, had left this world so young. Vanessa's mom was barely over 40. However, she looked in recent years no less than 60. Classmates took her for Vanessa's grandmother, and only she saw her as a beauty. And here, perhaps also a neighbor. Having collected everything necessary, Vanessa packed a change of clothes, documents, and the rest of the money. The girl closed the apartment and went to the train station. There were only a couple hours left before the train. Staying alone in the apartment was becoming more and more difficult. A city station at any time of the day is quite a sight. Not for nothing they say that train stations have seen more sincere love than marriage palaces. Vanessa witnessed the real emotions of parting, meeting, friendship, and love. It's as if at the moment of the last meeting before the road or the first after the separation, people's soul opens a little wider, and only the most sincere emotions are the first to burst out of it. Later, when the moment passes, people become more reserved and reserved. When the train came to the platform, the girl turned around for the last time and looked at the city she had grown up in and was now leaving, without much regret. I must say, what, in fact, can these streets and houses mean if there is no one left in the city who is dear to your heart? It so happened that she had no school friends and girlfriends. Or rather, once they had been, but the incomprehensible war, which was declared to her by a classmate, made everyone turn away from her. For 3 years of this war, not only Vanessa and all the other guys could not understand why Kiara was so beaten up on her. The fact that a rich, fashionable girl could simply envy the quiet Vanessa didn't even cross anyone's mind. For some reason, it was at the moment of leaving town that Vanessa remembered her high school years. Probably so that she finally confirmed the correctness of the decision to leave the city and not return. Sitting in the station building, she decided that she would stay in New York And if the maid job didn't work out, she would find another one. The main thing to get a foothold in the big city and return to her native tiny town without the prospect of forever will have time. Having made up her mind, she entered the carriage, changed her clothes, and fell into a sound and healthy sleep for the first time in months. Shortly before arriving at the New York train station, her phone rang. "Vanessa, are you there?" "Yes, in half an hour." "Yes." "Great. There's a car waiting for you." The caller gave the license plate number and a parking spot. Sitting in the cabin, she looked around the city with amazement. It seemed that she was in a fairy tale. Beautiful old buildings, bridges, parks, as if descended from the illustrations of fashion magazines. And here, amidst all this splendor, she was to live. Vanessa didn't think at all about the work she had to do. She was not afraid of hard or dirty work. She realized that she could hardly expect anything more now. But one thing she knew for sure was that she was not leaving the city. From the busy streets, the driver turned into a picturesque area. Multi-story buildings were replaced by beautiful mansions. Vanessa didn't even try to imagine who could live in them and what kind of income they had. She heard that the driver called someone and asked which exit to take the girl to. After getting an answer, he drove into the gate of one of the mansions and parked the car. Vanessa sat in a small, cozy lobby, waiting for the personnel manager. He turned out to be a short man, slightly over 40, athletic and focused. "Vanessa, I'm the one who called you. Come on, I'll familiarize you with your duties, show you how everything works here." "Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to work and bringing me here. I'm so grateful." "You'll thank me when you've worked here. You'll thank me when you've worked here. You may think it's a tough job. A lot of people can't handle it. But in fact, if you try hard enough, you can do it all." "Do you have any cleaning skills?" "I hope so. I used to help my mom at work a lot." "What was Mom like?" "She was a nurse and a hospital nurse. I worked with her to make it easier for her." "Mom doesn't work now." "Mom died a little over 2 weeks ago." Vanessa didn't notice the man clenching his jaw, as if in pain, but continued talking. "I'm sorry for your loss. We have a somewhat specific cleaning service. As you can see, the interior is very expensive. So for now, your duties will include cleaning the back rooms, the staff rooms, assisting the kitchen staff, let's just say interning on the sidelines. There will be 4 other girls interning with you. Only 2 will stay on. We're not fully staffed yet, so you could be useful in other jobs." "Is there anyone living in the house?" "Not yet. The owner lived abroad for a long time. The house was completed only last year and just the other day finished repair, decoration, and design. So we are still recruiting staff. If you work and show diligence, you will have quite decent positions." "Wages. Are you happy with it, by the way?" "I don't know, you haven't told me. I don't know." The man stopped so abruptly that Vanessa ran into him. "So you left your hometown and came to an unfamiliar metropolis without even finding out the terms of cooperation? What do I have to lose? I can't get a better job. I can always come back and get a job as a cleaner or a saleswoman. What have I got to lose?" "Yes, only at 18 you can think so recklessly." It seemed that the last phrase was addressed to myself. How much will I get? Based on the fact that you are a non-professional, inexperienced employee, plus you will live here and be provided with uniforms and food, about $50,000 a month. For the first month you will work without days off, the man warned when he saw the girl's face stretch after the song was announced. Are you serious? For a maid's job plus food, lodging and clothing is a dream. I don't quite understand you. Are you against it? I'm all for it. Yes, we're ready to work weekends, but also without lunch and sleep. Yes, just leave me alone. So you're happy with the terms? Yes. Great. Here's your room being set up. I'll see you downstairs in an hour. There'll be a general briefing and staff introductions. I'll be alone in the room? Of course. This isn't a dormitory. The landlord has a very human attitude towards people, including the servants. Thank you very much. Vanessa pressed herself against the man in a grateful impulse and felt for a moment that he wanted to respond to the embrace, but held back. Maybe in a hug, too. I think it's unnecessary, the man began, but Vanessa didn't listen. Thank you again. I'll do my best. I hope to see you in an hour. The uniforms are in the closet. For the first few minutes, Vanessa couldn't believe her happiness. More demanding girls might have thought, how can anyone be excited about the prospect of being a maid? But to her, it was fabulous luck, and she didn't want to miss the opportunity. Half an hour later, she was ready and standing in the hallway, trying to remember how to get to the lobby where all the staff was supposed to gather. The corridor was empty. It was quiet outside the room doors. The girl regretted not looking around as she walked and completely forgot to ask for directions to the lobby. Finally, she managed to get to the stairs, going down into a spacious room. The employees were already starting to gather there. Several girls, apparently also maids, were already drinking, getting acquainted and chatting. Besides them were the cook, several of his assistants, the gardener, the guards, the head maid, and the driver, who had brought Vanessa. The girl was just about to approach the others to get acquainted. But at that moment, the man who was introducing her to the house walked in. Suddenly, she realized that she hadn't even asked his name. That's a really strange impression she made on him, without asking his name, or working conditions, or the size of his salary. But she packed up and drove from her hometown to huge New York. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Alan, the house manager. I'm going to introduce you to the house rules. Most of the information you've already received. In addition, each of you has a small handout in your room regarding your responsibilities. I suggest you study them, especially for those who have no experience. The house is new, and the owners will move in only in a month. During this time, you and I need to get used to it and learn to work together as a team. You'll find the daily schedule in the room. We'll start living by it tomorrow. Today, familiarization with the house, responsibilities. I warn at once, personal relations, violation of discipline, bad habits, the reason for dismissal without clarification. For all this, you will have a weekend in the house. You are obliged to behave with dignity. The master is a man strict, conservative. Living in the house, he will be with his spouse and son. Perhaps his son's sweetheart will live in the house. How old are they all? One of the maid girls asked. The master's name is David. He and his wife Addison are 45. His son Matthew is 23. His girlfriend Ciara is just over 18. If I'm not mistaken. Our host is the owner of a large gemstone mining and processing corporation. His wife is the owner of a jewelry manufacturing firm. His son has recently finished his studies in England and will help his father in his business. But for any questions, you should contact me. Try to keep contact with family members to a minimum. They are reserved people, and this many strangers is also very stressful for them. They will bring in a staff member to clean their private rooms and serve at the table. It's complicated, said one of the girls. If you are not satisfied with these complications, you can always tell me and we will find a replacement for you, the man said calmly. No, I'm fine with it. Vanessa listened and could not believe her own ears. How far this world was from the one she lived in. Vanessa spent half the day learning the rules and duties, the routines. She walked around the part of the house where she was to work. Vanessa got to know all the staff. She was in such a confused state that she could not fully comprehend the amount of change that had taken place in her life. Perhaps it is only when you are young that you can be so carefree to enjoy everything and change your life so easily. From the next day, her labor career began. Accustomed to labor, the girl did not experience special difficulties, quickly performing the entire amount of work. It was for this that the other maids began to dislike her. The work, designed for the whole day, she performed in a few hours, not distracted by conversations. As a result, Alan began to grumble at the others, who were much less eager to work than Vanessa. By the end of the month, the entire staff had settled in, learned their duties, and established interpersonal relationships. Fortunately, fears of romance at work were completely unfounded. Almost all of the adult staff were married, and the maid girls were not interested in the single Alan, the driver, an unloved and withdrawn guy in his 30s. He was also to fulfill the duties of a security guard should the need arise. From one day to the next, the arrival of the family was awaited. Their rooms were ready the day before their arrival. Their assistant Chloe arrived to check on the final preparations. She appeared to be a stern and collected woman whose age was impossible to determine. She was equally likely to be in her 30s or 50s. One day, Vanessa decided to ask Alan a question that had been bothering her for a long time. "Alan, please tell me, why do you never call anyone by their middle name, everyone, including yourself? Do you introduce only by first name?" "It's a habit we picked up while we were living in England. There are no middle names there. Everyone calls each other by first or last name. David and Addison should be called that too, but I told you not to go near them yet." "I remember." The arrival of the hosts was not a special event for the staff. The cook cooked lunch, got orders for dinner. Chloe herself gave all the orders, working surprisingly well with Alan. The young maid girl suggested that they might well be having an affair. For dinner, they waited for the arrival of Ciara, the future daughter-in-law of the owners. The girl had been born and raised in Russia, but had spent the last few years in England, where she had met Matthew. The girl's father had a brilliant career, so she was a favorable party. She was to be surprised and charmed. What was Vanessa's surprise when she recognized her former classmate in the girl who arrived, the same one who had made her school years a living hell. Vanessa realized that as soon as Ciara saw her and recognized her, her days in this house would be numbered. So she had to do everything to make sure that the girl, the daughter-in-law of the master's son, did not notice her. Fortunately, the young people just a couple of weeks later went on vacation to one of the resorts. Sitting in the city in the summer was really unbearable. One day, Vanessa came running into one of the rooms, checking the dust on the top shelf of a massive closet. Getting to it with her short stature was impossible. She had to use a small ladder. Engrossed in her work, she didn't immediately notice she wasn't alone in the room. That's why when Matthew, who was watching her, coughed softly, she flinched, lost her balance, and fell down the stairs. Although the stairs were not high, the bruise from the fall could have been quite painful and serious if Matthew hadn't caught her on the fly. Tall and athletic, he picked up the petite girl as if she were nothing. For a few moments he held her in his arms, keeping his admiring gaze on her. It was the first time Vanessa had ever caught such a look of admiration. Since high school, she had been accustomed to thinking of herself as inconspicuous, unassuming, unworthy of attention. In college, the situation was no different. The few boys paid no attention to her, which combined with her unremarkable appearance, made her insecure. But now, when she was held in the arms of a stunningly handsome, tall, strong, and confident young man, literally eating her up with his eyes, Vanessa felt confident, strong, and charming, as if she were wearing a stunning outfit rather than a modest uniform. "I apologize if I startled you," Matthew said. His voice was like black velvet, enveloping me with softness. Vanessa said, "I'm very grateful to you. Could you put me down on the floor? Someone might come in. It would be a bad situation. I can explain everything to them." Matthew didn't seem to think of obeying her request, as if he realized that what she was saying was the exact opposite of what she wanted. "I have to insist," she said. Putting Vanessa on the floor, he held her in his arms for a few moments, pressing her gently against him and not letting her break free. Unable to tear her gaze away from him, Vanessa admired the perfect appearance of her master's son. Those rare moments when she did get to see him, she thought only of avoiding Kiara's eyes. Looking at her fiancé was something Vanessa dared not think about. But now she stood in the embrace of his strong arms and could think of nothing but how beautiful these moments were. As if with great regret, the young man unclasped his hands, releasing the girl. It should be noted, he did it very timely. Vanessa had no sooner taken a couple of steps toward the door than Lucinda entered the living room through the other entrance. "Honey, there you are. I've been looking all over for you," she said. Hearing the familiar voice behind her, Vanessa hurried to retrace her steps and hide in the nearest room. Closing the door and leaning against it, she tried to calm her frantic heartbeat for a few minutes. She herself couldn't answer exactly what caused it, the unexpected meeting with Kiara or the embrace of her fiancé. I should be more careful, Vanessa thought. Today she'll notice me, tomorrow she'll remember me. And the day after tomorrow I'll go back to my small town. Since that day, the girl tried her best not to be seen by any of the owners of the house, but it was much more difficult to command her heart. And is it possible at the age of 18? Vanessa fell in love with the son of the owner and could not command her heart not to long for the handsome young man, despite the fact that she had no chance to reciprocate. The next week passed relatively quietly. Matthew and Ciara went to Peterhof and stayed there for a week at the boyfriend's friend's house. Vanessa got a break and could move around the house more or less calmly and fulfill her duties with full dedication. The girl also saw the owners rarely and hardly ever encountered them in person. Alan, noting the responsibility of the staff, periodically made small changes in the staff or reassignment of duties. For example, Vanessa was assigned to clean the guest rooms and all those rooms where the owners were present. And although in this case the probability of crossing with them increased, the girl did not dare to disobey the manager. To avoid being accused of something terrible, Vanessa decided to tell Alan about what Kiara had done to her. "What was the reason?" the man asked after listening to her story. "I don't know. As far as I could tell, the guys didn't know either. It was just something she didn't like. And then she found all sorts of reasons to hate me more and more. Well, she's gone now, so you can work in peace. Well, she's gone. Besides, they're getting married in the fall, and then they're going on a honeymoon, after which she'll start school. She won't have time for you. She probably doesn't remember you. How long has it been since you've seen her?" "A little over 3 years. At the mention of the upcoming wedding of her lover and former classmate, Vanessa's legs nearly gave out. She didn't think the happy event would happen so soon. "Don't worry. It's good that you warned me. Don't worry. How come you were in the same class as her?" Her dad was from the local government back then and wanted to show how close he was to the people, which didn't stop his daughter from showing us what dirt we are, basically. "Yeah, tough luck for you. But why have I learned to ignore people like Ciara? Like your mom?" The man's voice broke out involuntarily, but he didn't even seem to notice. "How do you know what my mom was like?" Vanessa was surprised. "You told me." It was obvious that Alan was embarrassed and didn't know what to say. Maybe he said at last. The next day, Vanessa met the owner of the house for the first time. She was cleaning the table of photos, humming her mother's favorite song. At that moment, David entered the room. "Jessica," he said involuntarily when he saw the girl. "No, I'm Vanessa. I'm sorry, I didn't know you'd be home at this time. Alan told us to do the cleaning in your absence." "That's okay. Go ahead and work. I won't interrupt you. You just remind me of someone I know." "My mom's name was Jessica," David said unexpectedly. Vanessa continued working. At Alan's insistence, The staff tried not to engage in conversation with the owner. She didn't see the man's face change, as if he had seen a ghost in front of him. The next day, Alan told her that Chloe and the landlady were away on business, and in their absence she would be responsible for cleaning the owner's rooms. Why me? I thought I was only allowed to clean the hallways and the living room. It's David's personal order, Alan replied. It was obvious that he was not happy with this decision. Vanessa was not going to argue with her boss, so she went to clean David's room, assuming that he had already left for work. The huge apartment, furnished in classical style, decorated in gray pastel colors, reminded her of a trip to a museum. She spent a few minutes looking at the rich furnishings, which were different from what was in the rest of the house. That was why she did not immediately notice that her host had not left, but was sitting in a deep armchair by the window, apparently immersed in his thoughts. The girl's first impulse was to go out and return later. But at that moment the man raised his hand, in which he held an old photo from his seat. It was perfectly visible who was depicted on it. The black and white photo showed a happy couple standing, embraced on the seashore. The young man was David, only much younger by about 20 years. And the girl Vanessa recognized her mother. It was the very photo she had found after her mom's funeral. Only in her mom's photo, the man was ripped off. Unable to restrain the first impulse, the girl said, "Where did you get a photo of my mom?" David flinched. He seemed to be so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice her entering. Quickly putting the photo away, he stood up and got ready to leave the room. "You didn't answer," Vanessa stopped him. "You made a mistake. That's me and my wife when we were young. My mom has the exact same photo, only you're torn off. And your wife is the same height as you. That's my petite mom in the photo. How do you know her?" Vanessa looked into the man's eyes. Many times she had read in books that in the eyes you can find the answer to all questions, and she had never understood how that was possible. Now, looking at the pain reflected in them, the girl realized what the man could not say out loud. "You're my father," she said. David took a deep breath and turned away from the window. Apparently it was easier for him to talk that way. "Yes, but I didn't know Jessica had a baby for a long time. When we broke up, I had Alan keep an eye on her, watch her from afar, help her if she needed it. A year later, however, he told me he'd met Jessica. She absolutely refused any help or any mention of me at all. It turns out he didn't stop looking after you. When you were orphaned, he was the one who made sure you were placed in our home. And you didn't know about this?" "No, not until yesterday. He wanted to keep you close so you wouldn't get into trouble. He hoped I wouldn't recognize you. Basically, he had the right idea. We weren't planning on living in this house for long. The chances of us crossing paths were minimal. But why did you and Mom break up? Do you have any idea? I had a family, a kid, Jessica. And Jessica was just a temporary fling. A distraction from the family routine," the girl finished harshly. "No, you're wrong," David objected. "She was never just an infatuation for me. Not her. She and I met here in Chicago. She was visiting the museum, and I had business nearby. We bumped into each other, got to talking. Then walked around the city until midnight. I just lost my head so much that I sent my family overseas and flew on vacation with Jessica. She was so sweet, so pure, so light, so trusting. I was serious about divorcing Addison and marrying your mom. What stopped you from doing that?" "My father. When he found out what I was doing, he was quick to bring me back down to earth. Our business was completely dependent on Addison's father. If I'd left her, my father-in-law would have left us with nothing. At best. At worst, we'd be found somewhere out of town. And it wasn't just my life I was risking. Jessica wouldn't have survived either." I couldn't lie any further, so I told the truth. She was broken and crushed. In the end, she asked me to leave her and never come into her life again. I couldn't just let her disappear. I offered to move to Chicago so I could see her once in a while. And what did she do? Did you know your mother well? She refused, Vanessa replied. Of course she did. I haven't seen her since, but my father asked Alan to keep an eye on her. Well, you know the rest. I saw the deed to the apartment, so Alan gave it to me. I didn't realize who he was at the time. I see now. Maybe he didn't tell me about it. I didn't know about you until yesterday. I mean, the best person to ask is Alan, I guess. I was having a hard time with our breakup. I wanted to go to her and apologize, but suddenly I got the news that Matthew was very ill. I got on the same flight to see him. My father did everything he could to save Matthew, and I came back as late as possible. When I got back, Alan said Jessica was missing, and he couldn't find any trace of her. That's probably when you showed up, and that's how he kept you from me. Maybe he did the right thing. Knowing that my beloved had a child with me, I could hardly resist leaving everything for you. But you had a child in your family, too. Yes, I did, David said absently, and turned back to the window. Vanessa decided that the conversation was over and left the room quietly. As she was about to close the door, she realized and asked, "Can I continue working here?" "I won't say anything to anyone, I promise." "You're just like your mother." "You're not a mercenary," David replied. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you can stay, but promise not to tell anyone about anything. If I may, it's going to be hard to explain now." Back in her room, Vanessa took a long time to come to her senses. The man she had never dreamed of meeting turned out to be her master, the owner of a huge fortune and family. Vanessa tried not to think about it at all. After all, now it turned out that she had fallen in love with her own brother for the first time. Now her love was not only unrequited, hopeless, but also criminal. Incestuous. She had to forbid herself to even think about it. The ideal would be to quit this house and forget this family like a bad dream. About demanding something from her father, the girl did not even think about it. After sitting in the room for about half an hour, Vanessa decided to find Alan and consult with him. Besides, she wanted to question him, because he almost certainly knew she was the owner's daughter when he invited her to work in his house. Besides, she hadn't fulfilled her duties, and she was used to working responsibly. Right now, though, the thing she wanted most was to pack her things and leave for her hometown. Probably my mother also decided almost 20 years ago, when she refused all the benefits offered by my father, refused to destroy his family. Although she herself, with great difficulty, was able to raise her daughter on her feet. Maybe that's why she left life so early? There was a knock at the door. Vanessa realized she'd been in the room for quite some time. Did they notice her absence? Alan was at the door. "We need to talk," he said, and gestured for her to follow him. Vanessa thought it would be about her and the fact that she had learned the secret of her birth. However, judging by how tense and even angry the man was, the girl guessed that something similar had happened. "What do you think you're doing?" Alan asked. "What are you talking about?" Vanessa feigned innocence. "And pretending to be an innocent fool. And pretending to be an innocent fool. She's making a spectacle of herself here, saying that Ciara might slander you, and she's hanging herself around Matthew's neck." "I didn't hang myself. I fell down the stairs. He caught me. And at 12 this afternoon, I've been bombarded with questions about who he is and where he's from. I don't know where he is or how he's acting. I was checking the dust in the closet. Standing on the stairs, he quietly walked in. I lost my balance, almost fell. That's the whole story of our interaction. I swear to you. Learn, girl. I won't allow you to interfere in the lives of family members." "You won't? Then why did you bring me here? Or are you telling me you didn't know who the owner was? Or didn't you buy my mom an apartment when I was born? Didn't you look after her? You didn't find me?" It doesn't matter. I just have one question for you: why? Alan didn't seem to be so much taken aback by the news as by the fierce intensity with which she spoke. How do you know everything? He wondered. You probably haven't noticed that I look remarkably like my mother, but my father did. Besides, I saw a photo of them together, so there's no reason for me to be messing around with my own brother. Still not recovered, the man sat down and was silent for a few minutes, as if gathering his thoughts and choosing words. Finally, he spoke. Yes, I did buy the apartment for Jessica, because David had done her an injustice. He had no right to leave her like that, like a tired toy. Not her. Pride wouldn't let her tell him about the baby. Pride wouldn't let her ask for money to support her. That's why I didn't tell him anything about you. He just had no right to know that he had a child. His baby is his own. His own. But he'd already had Matthew by then. Yeah, another baby. I fell in love with her, and I wanted her to be my wife. I'd raise you like a daughter, take care of you and Mommy. But she loved your father and chose him again. Again. Don't you think there's too much you're leaving out? Vanessa asked. I don't need the whole truth. It doesn't concern me. Why did you bring me here? I wanted to keep you under supervision. I didn't think he'd recognize you. I didn't think he'd recognize you, that Matthew would be interested in you. You're just a child. You're not old enough to live on your own. That's why I found you, invited you to work here. I can't stay here anymore, Vanessa said. I'm sorry, but it's beyond me. Why not? What's stopping you? Did David ask you to do this? No, he asked me not to tell anyone yet. So stay here for now. I'll decide what's best. Okay. While Vanessa was thinking of an answer, Alan got a call. What? Where is he? Is he alive? What hospital is he in? The man exclaimed. A moment later, he sprinted out of the room and rushed toward the service exit. Vanessa remained, not realizing what had happened. By late afternoon, it was learned that Matthew, while riding out of town in an automobile, had been involved in an accident. The likelihood that he would be alive was minimal. From the news, Vanessa could hardly stand on her feet. David rushed to see his son at the hospital. Alan was there too. The others had to wait to see if the young man would survive the night. By morning, it was reported that the boy needed a blood transfusion, and a few hours later it became known that the injuries were much more serious than the doctors had decided the day before. A lot of blood was needed. In addition, the guy had a rather rare group, the 4th negative. In such a situation, the ideal donor could be someone close to him. Vanessa's first impulse was to offer herself as a donor, but her Rh factor was positive. She was surprised by this. She had known since high school that children inherited their father's Rh factor, so it had to be the same for her and Matthew. Meanwhile, the search for a suitable donor was unsuccessful, and time was literally counting by minutes. Close relatives and all those who were in the hospital at the time were checked for a match. Unexpectedly, Alan turned out to be a suitable donor candidate. No one paid any attention to it at the time. Everyone was alarmed by the guy's condition and was glad that he would live. Recovery took quite a long time. The young and healthy body was taking its toll despite the serious injuries. Chiara was sent back to England by her father so as not to upset her. Besides, the school year was starting and the girl was just beginning her studies. The wedding due to the accident had to be postponed. It seemed that neither the bride nor the groom was particularly upset by this news. At the end of August, Matthew was discharged from the hospital. Vanessa, who all this time tried not to show her father in front of her eyes and not to remember about her inappropriate feelings for her brother, realized that her idea to go home at the beginning of summer was the most reasonable. It turned out that Alan had interrogated her on the day of the accident for a reason. Matthew had shared his plans for Vanessa with him. The guy really fell in love and planned to leave the bride imposed by her father. He was not at all embarrassed by the fact that his beloved was a maid and that his father would be furious when he found out about everything. He decided to share his plans with someone he had grown accustomed to trusting since childhood. Uncle Alananu, his father's assistant and longtime friend, had actually raised the boy. In many ways, Matthew trusted him much more, so he decided to confide his plans for his upcoming marriage to him as well. Trust him, and ask for advice. Alan realized that the boy's youth and inexperience could ruin not only his life and career, but also hurt his father. In his first impulse, Alan wanted to send Vanessa back to her hometown. His plans were thwarted by an accident, and then he realized that he was doing to Matthew exactly the same thing his father had once done to David when he forced him to leave Jessica. However, he wasn't going to let their relationship go as far. Another naive, jilted girl and another unhappy child. No, that wasn't what Alan was going to allow. He made the decision to give them time to work things out. Maybe this relationship would work itself out. Or maybe there was no love affair. Just a desire to go against his father's plans. So he decided not to get involved. Besides, it had been over 2 months, and the infatuation with the girl might have worn off in the young man's head. Unfortunately for him, Matthew not only did not forget about his infatuation with the young maid, but from the first day he decided to take active steps. And the first step was a huge bouquet, which Vanessa found under her door the next morning. There was no envelope with an indication of the giver, but it was not required. There were, and could be, no options. Vanessa decided to nip his advances in the bud. Entering the young man's room, she caught him warming up. After a month of forced bed rest and recovery from fractures, the guy decided to make up for lost time. His leg was still in a cast after a bad fracture, but he had already asked to have arm exercisers installed in the room. The moment Vanessa walked in, he was working out while listening to music through headphones. He couldn't hear her enter, and she froze, seeing him so perfect, so athletic. Apollo in a cast. Considering that she'd hardly had relationships or attention from guys before, she wanted to give in to his advances, if only for a short time, and then tell him everything, or silently disappear and live the rest of her life in happy memories. She must have been too deep in thought, because Matthew had noticed her presence and was saying something to her. I'm glad Vanessa seemed to have listened to the most important part of the conversation, considering how wide and happy the guy was smiling. I'm sorry, I was listening. What were you talking about? I was saying that I'm going to break up with her today and tell my dad. Tell him what? I guess I hit my head a little, Matthew joked. I couldn't help it, and I can hear you. I can't understand why you make decisions that affect me without asking my opinion. I thought you liked me too. There's a very, very, very big difference between liking you and running to the ends of the earth with you. But for example, you and I haven't met. I'm a maid. You're a millionaire's son. I'm a college graduate. You're a prestigious foreign university. You're rich and famous, I'm not. I wanted to finish, but she didn't dare. I don't see the problem. We've got plenty of time to get to know each other. How old are you? 19 soon. Great. Plenty of time to get a decent education. It's not like I'm dragging you to the wedding on your doorstep like Ciara and I did. Let's just be around each other and get to know each other. I like you a lot, and I can't believe you don't feel the same way about me. With those words, Matthew reached out his arms to her and gently pulled her to him. She should have resisted, should have turned away, should have pulled away and pushed him away. Great came a familiar voice. I'm gone for a couple weeks, and he's already smirking. With some girl. A furious Ciara stood in the doorway, glaring at the couple. Ciara, what are you doing here? Matthew didn't seem bothered by the fact that he was kissing another girl in front of his fiancée. He didn't even open his arms, still holding Vanessa to his chest. The same ones you did. You're so shameless. Now let her go. I don't know who you're hugging. It would have been nice if she was a famous model. Stop, Ciara shouted, yanking Vanessa's arm away from Matthew. I can't believe it. The maid. What are you doing here anyway? You haven't changed a bit. You're still the same ugly gray mouse. Ciara, stop it. Matthew stood up for Vanessa, not surprised that the girls knew each other. What are you, silent? Did you choke on your tongue as usual? What brings you here? Are you trying to get back at me? You sneak into my fiancé's house and get into bed with him. Don't get your hopes up, you won't get him. Ciara, you're wrong. Vanessa tried to justify herself. I took a job in this house, not knowing that it would soon be yours. I came to Matthew's room to see if he needed anything cleaned or brought in, and I accidentally fell on his lips. And he asked me to help him up out of his chair. I did. Ciara finished. You've never been good at lying, but now you decided to try. Well, that's a ridiculous excuse to fall for. Anyway, she turned to her fiancé. It's going to stop today, or else, well, she knows it will be otherwise. With that, the girl left the room, slamming the door so that a painting fell from the wall. The glass shattered into several dozen pieces, one of which bounced off and hurt Matthew's hand. Damn, what a fury. He laughed, trying to pull the shard out of the wound. Let me help, Vanessa said on impulse. But after a couple of minutes, Vanessa regretted it, because she found herself pressed against the door. The young man, not waiting for her to object, kissed her. Her legs gave out and she would have fallen if he hadn't put his arms around her. Gathering her will in a fist, she managed to pull away and say, "Don't ever do that again." But you liked it, didn't you? The guy grinned and reached for her for another kiss. This time, Vanessa managed to dodge. I have to clean this place up, she said, ducking out the door and trying to hide in her room as quickly as possible. After catching her breath, she went back to the kitchen, grabbed a dustpan and broom, and headed for Matthew's room. This time he was fully dressed and sitting in front of the TV. Calm down? Let's continue. I'm here to clean up the glass, Vanessa said. I hope you won't hurt your hand with anything else. Not anymore. But you didn't remove that shard from me either. If you behave like this, it'll stay in your hand, and you'll let it, Matthew said mockingly. And if it starts to get blood poisoning and I die without glory or honor? The young man's voice was enveloping and made him think of anything but work. No, I can't let David get blood poisoning, Vanessa said. No, you can't. He was the only one with the right blood. He's had a lot of it pumped out of him. That's right. That's the only thing worth living for. I'll appreciate him even more now. He's been my best and truest friend before, and now we're of the same blood. You were the same blood before. No one else had such a rare bloodline. Not even your parents, Vanessa blurted out. She was about to bite her tongue off for that last sentence, because Matthew clung to her like a bulldog. What's weird, your parents don't have a band like mine. I misspoke. And anyway, I have to go. Or you're not going anywhere until you explain what you meant. Matthew's tone went from playful to affectionate to categorical, unapologetic. I didn't mean anything, except that children most often inherit their parents' Rh factor, Vanessa said hastily. If I remember my biology course well, if a child has it negative, it means that he took it from his parents or one of them. So if my parents have it positive and I have it negative, I'm a foundling? No, why? Maybe your father's Rh factor is positive. Usually children inherit it from their father. But I'm not sure, I don't know. We should go to the hospital, she suggested. The boy seemed to understand everything and began to reason out loud. Alan's father is an acquaintance from childhood. They were friends. Alan devoted his whole life to sports, and his father went into business. When he was able to make good money, he invited Alan to become a personal security guard. Gradually, he took on other responsibilities such as running the house. Always together, always there for each other. Never a quarrel. And now Alan becomes the only suitable donor for me. Well, maybe you don't know and someone else helped? Vanessa suggested. There are all sorts of reasons why a person can't be a donor illnesses. For example, maybe your mom with the same rhesus. Vanessa regretted 100 times that she had voiced her doubts aloud. No, only Alan's Matthew cut her off. He seemed oblivious to the fact that Vanessa was still in the room. He gestured toward the door, signaling that she should leave the room. He picked up the phone from the table and dialed a familiar number. "You can come to my room. It's an emergency," the guy shouted after he heard an attempted objection. Going downstairs, Vanessa ran into Alan on the stairs, who was walking with quick steps towards Matthew's room. Finishing her business, the girl returned to her room and began packing. It was naive to believe that she was in a position to fight this. It had some incomprehensible magical power over her, making her lose her will and her mind. The consequences could be most unpredictable and terrible. So she should have left the house, returned to her own place, and thought about how to live further, how and what to earn money for. About demanding from her father financial help or his participation in her life. The girl did not even think about it. She wanted to forget this page of her life. No sooner had she packed her things than the phone rang. It was Alan. He asked her to come up to Matthew's room. His voice was calm but strange. "I told you not to go where you don't belong." Alan greeted her with those words as soon as she could enter. "Wait, don't scare her before she's ready. Maybe things can still work out very well." Matthew cheered up after talking to Alan, as if he had heard great news. "I don't understand what's going on," Vanessa said. "Alan, I wanted to ask you to pay me back. I can't stay here any longer. Of course you've made a mess, and you're in the bushes." "No, darling, you're not going to do it now." "No, dear, you're not going anywhere now," Alan grinned. Matthew tried to grab the girl's hand. The attempt, however, was unsuccessful, and he fell back onto the bed where he had been sitting. Vanessa instinctively rushed over to him for support. "I told you she loves me too," Matthew laughed, standing up easily and hugging the girl. I see that history is repeating itself again. And your father will not be happy about this news." Alan shook his head. "Not to mention your fiancée and her father." "My fiancée is in front of you," Matthew objected. "Will someone please explain to me what's even going on here?" Vanessa pulled out of Matthew's embrace. She looked from one to the other, trying to figure out what they were hiding. "Alan, tell me. She knows half of this terrible secret anyway. Besides, she thinks she's in love with her brother. And don't argue, I can see that you like me," the guy said when the girl tried to get indignant. "Judy, sit down. This is going to be a long conversation," Alan said. "David and I grew up in the same neighborhood. Ever since kindergarten, we've done every mischief together. Never fought, always helping each other out. We lived like that for almost 10 years until a military family moved in next door. The incoming officer and his wife had a beautiful daughter, Addison. As you can imagine, that's Matthew's mom. We were both crazy about her, chasing her around like puppies. And we weren't the only ones. She was the star of the school within a year. Nobody even noticed her at first. And then we graduated and moved away. And we met at the New Year's Eve ball at school, not knowing what David had charmed her with. They had an affair. But I didn't want to give up either, even though I couldn't stand in the way of their happiness. So I finally confessed everything to her and gave her a choice." "She chose David?" Vanessa asked. "No, she did what a real woman would do. She stayed with one man and got pregnant by another," Matthew said angrily. "Don't you dare say that. It's your mother." Alan almost punched the young man in the face. "Matthew, stop it." "Alan, what happened next? Tell me." As crude as it sounds, Matthew expressed the essence of what happened, Alan said. "She did choose David, and she gave me a generous gift that I couldn't have hoped for on the last night. Who would have thought that was the night she'd get pregnant?" "Yeah. So that's why you have the same blood type?" Vanessa guessed. "Yeah, I've suspected that for a long time," Matthew said. "I look a lot like you. The same habits. My father and I were always like strangers." "When did you find out that Addison's baby was your son?" "When she and David set a wedding date, I decided to leave. Stay out of the way. I signed a contract and joined the army. Came back almost 6 years after I was wounded. No family, no money. David found me and invited me to stay with him. The first time I saw Matthew, I knew he was my son. I don't know how the others didn't see it. That's around the time David met Jessica. I thought to myself, this is my chance. Jessica's going to leave, and I'm going to marry Addison. And we'll all be happy," Alan said. "Yeah, happy?" Matthew queried. "Did you forget that in the world of money, no one's happy?" "Yeah, you're right. And Addison had made it clear to me that she didn't want me. To be honest, I'd grown cold to her during the separation. So I helped David cover up the whole Jessica thing. I bought her an apartment while I looked after her." "You fell in love?" Vanessa asked. "You sure did. We even have the same taste in women. Only Jessica remained faithful to her first, and only loved for the rest of her life." "Yeah, Mom never looked at another man after that," Matthew confirmed. "Well, it was a story that was gradually forgotten. David took his family abroad. I went with them. I lived in 2 countries. And when Jessica was gone, I decided to move Vanessa closer to me so I could keep an eye on her. Addison and his son decided to come back to America too," Vanessa guessed. "And then you know the rest, my friends. I don't know how you fell in love, but this guy interrogated me today. I had to come clean." "So you're Matthew's father?" Vanessa asked. "Does David know?" "No, I don't think so. Anyway, we've never talked about it." "Yeah, it's a real passion," Vanessa shook her head. "It's like a movie." "It's better than that," Matthew grinned. "Now, I don't know if my alleged father will send me away and bequeath all his millions to you." "Matthew, stop it. It's not funny." "That's not funny. It's only fair, really. And I won't have to marry you or your daughter. I mean, he doesn't need me to make family connections with his business partners." "Hey, I'm a good sport about this. Hey, I'm a good sport about this. You're going to be a rich heiress, and I'm going to get you again. Then I'll have the money again." Matthew seemed to be enjoying the situation. "I wouldn't be so happy if I were you," Vanessa said. "I think we should keep it a secret." "At least for now," Alan said. "I mean, Dad, are you crazy? Where's the secrecy going to go from here?" So for a quarter of a century, everyone was silent. And it's not like David hadn't guessed anything. "I suggest we get everyone together at the family council and confess everything. Have a night of revelations," Matthew suggested. "It turns out that both parents were dishonest, both cheated, and both had children on the side." "Yourself?" Alan questioned. "But in fact, I'm an illegitimate child too." "I'm not sure everyone will be as thrilled," Vanessa replied. "I'm sure we can't keep quiet," Matthew insisted. "Let's do it this way. I'll tell David myself. And then we'll think about it." The 3 of them went about their business. And not knowing that the capricious and resentful Ciara had already complained to her father about her fiancé Matthew. The man had never been known for his gentle nature, being resentful and suspicious. The fact that his potential partner couldn't keep his son in line meant that he would be just as soft in business. and he didn't want to do business with such people. By the time Alan had persuaded Matthew and Vanessa to keep quiet and not tell anyone what they'd learned, Ciara's father had already ordered the withdrawal of his investments in all of David's projects. Breaking up the deals threatened to lose large sums of money. Not getting a clear answer from his subordinates, David went home in a frenzy to seek an answer from his son. And the first person he saw in Matthew's room was his newfound daughter Vanessa in his son's arms. "How dare you?" David screamed at Vanessa. "Did you purposely show up to destroy my family? I will crush you to dust." "And you, puppy," he said to Matthew, "get dressed immediately and go to your fiancée. I don't care how, but you will beg her forgiveness. You'll restore the engagement. Her father will get his money back, invested in my business. And I'll deal with you later," he said to Vanessa. "I wouldn't be in such a hurry," Matthew replied. "Besides, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not even your subordinate, let alone anything more." "What did you say?" David was outraged. "I'll take everything away from you. You'll forget what expensive cars and resorts look like, where you used to spend my money." "I'm scared," Matthew replied calmly. "I'm already educated. Thank you, I'm sure, but you can't take it away. But you can't take it away from me. I'll take care of the rest." "You've never earned a penny in your life. You've never earned a penny in your life." "Now you're showing a little attitude," David continued to shout. "I'm a grown man. As soon as I'm in shape, I'll leave your apartment. What's the holdup? I can have the room today. I think it's rightfully yours for your child to occupy." "Yes, Dad," Matthew said calmly. "Or did you think that your little secret of having a daughter out of wedlock would remain a secret?" David turned pale and sat back in his chair. He seemed suddenly short of breath. "What makes you think that?" he hissed. "Oh, don't say that. I have the courage to confess. And bonus, you get one more little secret. But just in case you think I'm hugging my own sister, Matthew." "What are you talking about?" David shook his head. "Yeah, so he didn't know. Well, Alan wanted to tell you, but I beat him to it." "Tell me what? Dad, have you known this your whole life?" Matthew stared at his father. "Didn't you ever see anything in me in common with him? Even I had my doubts as a child, when he and I had common tastes and interests." "That's impossible. Addison was faithful to me," David said stubbornly. "By and large, yes. They had a little adventure with your friend before you got married. That's why he moved away, so that he wouldn't interfere with your happiness." "You're wrong about what? That I'm his son?" Matthew asked. "I assure you I only found out today. Or rather, I guessed it, thanks to your clever and attentive daughter Vanessa. It was in her bright head came the idea that the parents with a positive Rh factor, having the second type of blood, cannot have a child with the fourth negative. Genetics is a scary, stubborn, and surprisingly accurate in such matters. I checked. Vanessa was right. The fact that Alan was the only suitable donor only made her suspicious. "And you should have warned us all," Matthew continued wryly. "Why?" "Because you should have been in school, not skipping classes." Vanessa looked at Matthew and couldn't believe her own eyes. In just one morning, he had gone from a sweet and handsome boy to a tough and sarcastic one. He seemed to enjoy seeing the effect his words had on David. Meanwhile, the man was getting worse as he unbuttoned his shirt collar and loosened the knot of his tie. From the change in his complexion, his condition was alarming. "Matthew, stop it," Vanessa exclaimed. "You can see he needs help." Grabbing the phone, she called an ambulance. Then she called Alan and David's driver. Together, they managed to carefully take the man downstairs to the exit, where the ambulance was already arriving. The girl decided to accompany her newfound father to the hospital. She instructed Alan to talk to Matthew so he wouldn't do anything stupid again. David was taken to the hospital just in time. On the background of high blood pressure and stress, he had a stroke. Fortunately, there were doctors nearby, which meant that it was hoped that the consequences would not be so devastating. The man stayed in hospital for about 2 weeks, after which there was a long period of rehabilitation. Vanessa lived between the hospital and home. Even though her father had received excellent care at the expensive hospital, she was terrified to even imagine that she could lose her last loved one, barely finding him. She'd only crossed paths with Matthew a couple times in all this time. He, too, seemed to have lost interest in her. As soon as the cast was removed from her leg, Matthew moved out of the house without telling her where he was going. Before he left, he contacted his mother, who was in Los Angeles, and warned her that she shouldn't show up at their new home yet, for her father had found out her little secret. "Don't feel bad about it," Addison replied. "He has one of his own." Suddenly, his illegitimate daughter, Ciara, had turned up and was now staying in his bed. He's probably already made her his sole heir. "So you have no business in LA," Matthew said sharply. "What daughter? What are you talking about?" "Matthew, your life with him has never been perfect," Addison replied. "So I don't think you're surprised by this news. Besides, he's a man, and men have a tendency to have affairs on the side. At least, I understand him. Besides, it's not your place to complain about him." "Hisham, how's he doing?" "He'll live. They got him to the hospital on time, and he's got the best doctors in the world." "Have you been to see him?" "No, why?" "As it turns out, I'm nothing to him now." "He raised you? Even if you didn't know he wasn't your father, he put all his heart, soul, love, and a lot of money into you." "Is that what you're saying?" "That too. How can you be so callous?" "I'm not callous. I'm sober. There's no point in me staying there now, which is why I'm calling you, so you don't accidentally show up. I'm on the next flight out. It's a shame your health and the lives of your family don't mean anything to you. I'm sorry. In spite of everything, your father and I have been together for over 20 years. It's up to you. Don't be surprised to find a new mistress at home. Let me handle this." The next day, the woman was in New York. She decided to come home later and went to the hospital right after the airport. Her husband's condition was indeed quite satisfactory. Still, a healthy and fairly young body was able to cope with such a test. In the corridor, Addison met Vanessa. Surprisingly, the girl seemed completely different from how her son had presented her. Even though they had a romantic relationship looming, David was resting after his treatments, so the woman decided to ask Vanessa about him. Vanessa talked about David's well-being and the doctor's prognosis. Somehow, imperceptibly, the conversation turned to who Vanessa really was. The girl told how she herself had found out that her master was her father. How Matthew had guessed that Alan was his father. In fact, they hadn't noticed how they had talked for hours, sitting in the quiet hospital cafe. After talking to the girl, Addison went to her husband's room and Vanessa went home. She was to give the order to prepare a room for the mistress. Lately, she had taken over the housekeeper's duties and was doing a fine job with them. Alan was away on a business trip. Addison came home in the evening and was pleasantly surprised to see that they had prepared for her arrival. She said that they had discussed things with her husband calmly without mutual complaints or recriminations. In the end, they came to the conclusion that they would keep the family together, because many years had passed since their transgressions. Matthew David promised to help with his own business, and Vanessa to send to study. Now it was their mutual children. Besides, Vanessa had no one else but them. Sometimes life presents us with serious tests of willpower, kindness, loyalty, humanity. It is important not only to deal with the problem, but also to understand and learn the lesson. And the most important thing is to remain human in any situation. Vanessa was lucky. Life compensated her for the most difficult loss with several new acquisitions, family, prospects, opportunities, study. And although no one and nothing could replace her mother, now she could rely on her father. Robert had been surrounded by female attention since kindergarten. The girls tried to be paired with him at matinees, brought him candy and cookies from home, insisted that at quiet time their crib was next to each other. They demanded at home that they bought the most beautiful hairpins for their hair or weave into the braid a brighter colored ribbon. This frenzy never ceased. At school, this state of affairs only worsened. Not by years, a tall boy with dark hair and blue eyes broke the hearts of not only classmates, but also teachers from the fairer sex. They did not raise their hands to reprimand him or lower his grade when his answers were not up to the highest grade. Although his appearance did not resemble the appearance of an angel, he did not look like a demon at all. He was like a stately, humble Greek god with a piercing gaze and an enchanting smile. He didn't speak, but he spoke the words that obediently formed into correct sentences without stuttering. He studied easily, took prizes at Olympiads in all subjects, gallantly asked girls to dance at festive parties, moved amazingly during incendiary discos, turning any music into his obedient servant. Robert and Elizabeth were inseparable almost from the very beginning of their acquaintance. It was useless to drive a wedge between them. The girl moved to this city with the family of her military father. She was laconic in everything: clothes, hairstyle, school bag, pens, and notebooks. When the class wanted to make fun of it, Robert was right there. Somehow it happened that he took under his protection a little girl who stood last in the long row in gym class. The girl with gray eyes, two pigtails, tied with black rubber bands, for some reason caused in him a pinch of pity. A lump in his throat stuck. But this little girl was not a bad girl. She pulled the girls back, asking what kind of dense material she was made of. We lived in the north for a long time. In the schools there, they were heated in winter, but we still had to insulate additionally. Do you want to talk about it? The curious people backed off at once. What's the point of getting involved with someone like that? It's not worth it. She's too quick with her tongue. Robert grinned to himself and invited Elizabeth to sit at the same desk with him. It's free. I usually sit alone. You'll be comfortable. You can see the blackboard. It's the penultimate desk in this row by the window. In his soul, he had not yet settled in Elizabeth's address romantic notes, but he always wanted to take care of her like some young, helpless puppy. At home, he had a beagle given to him just at that time for his birthday. He had dreamed of a sheepdog, but their apartment would not support such a large dog. Here in their family, an appeared mischievous cute beagle, a faithful friend, selflessly loving later their masters and completely unpretentious in care, the sweetest companion with soft ears and a long tail. Robert was unusually patient with his parents, cuddling and nurturing him all the time. Suddenly he realized that Elizabeth was more than just a friend, companion, and sister in spirit to him. When she badly shattered her knees one winter when she fell on the ice, they were already in 8th grade at the time. From a small, graceful statue, Elizabeth began to turn into a petite young lady with the crushes inherent in her young age. The girl was incredibly stubborn. She dragged him home after school across a smooth, vacant lot prepared for digging foundations for a new building. "Don't go, Robert. It'll be 5 minutes before we're home. It's too long and uninteresting to walk around that fence, especially in this weather," she urged. He'd fallen for her pleas. Now she was sitting on the cold ground with her tights torn to shreds and deep lacerations on her knees, stumbled over pieces of rebar left behind by who knows who. He didn't hesitate long, picked her up in his arms and carried her to his house where no one was present. In the apartment, he treated the wounds, which, after he had washed away all the blood with peroxide, did not seem so horrible anymore. They were 14 years old. Hormones were certainly starting to rage in their bodies by now, but they weren't what made him kiss her lap near the wounds. Tenderness nudged him gently. She wasn't frightened. She leaned over, hugged his head, and nuzzled the top of his head. "Robert, are you scared?" It's okay. You've got tea in the house or something to go with it, haven't you? I'm starving. I'll never make it home, she laughed. From that day on, they kissed each other on the cheek when they met. They walked mostly hugging now, but without any hint of closer proximity. Peer girls were ready to wipe Robert in powder for the fact that Robert did not notice anyone around, but they did not dare to do any harm, only sometimes they let out barbs. But the young couple could do nothing. Even stain their friendship could not, so pure and light it was. In the graduating class, everything suddenly changed. Both grew up and could no longer ignore the natural laws of nature. Robert realized that this was his first love. She was not a whim or a temporary eclipse brought on by young age. This girl had firmly established herself in his heart. It happens that even handsome men belong to the clan of those who meet their only woman once and are faithful to love her afterward for a lifetime. Let someone try to argue that this is a fairy tale. After school, both entered the university, he at the Faculty of Physics and she at the Faculty of Economics. In the educational institution on Robert again began the hunt. Having gone through the crucible of naive passions at school, Elizabeth and Robert did not even cast a glance at his admirers, and they, like snakes, hissed back. Where's he ever been? He's at least in Hollywood, starring in a movie instead of Richard Gere. They can't be together. It's absurd. In one of the lectures in my freshman year, I was amused by a scene. The subject was common history. Different departments listened to it together, without division into physicists, chemists, geographers, and economists. Among the female students, as usual, was its star, its first beauty, its prima donna. She had bet with her fellow students that she would steal Robert away from Elizabeth in no time. She was counting on her striking looks. Men on the streets would crane their necks when they saw her in the crowd. She didn't mince words with the guy, she just sat down on his lap without even giving him a second thought. In front of the student crowd, not at all embarrassed. Robert didn't bother to embarrass the arrogant person. With an expression as if he had touched a nasty toad, he took her by the shoulder with 2 fingers and pulled her off his lap. Don't ever do that again. My heart is occupied. It's about time you all realize that. Belle was taken aback. Are you talking about that roof that's always dangling beneath your feet? Don't make us all laugh. What could you possibly have in common with her? Robert's blue eyes filled with an angry glint. Thank you, my girlfriend can't hear you right now. But the rest of us should know that behind your beautiful shell hides an evil heart that knows no true feelings. You're nothing. I don't envy anyone who would give their soul to you. You'd trample it for nothing. After these words, the curious crowd parted and Elizabeth came up. Robert calmly put his arm around her shoulders and said, "Come, let us sit in the other row. There's a foul smell of meanness here. I hate that insidious odor." Elizabeth did not understand anything, but she did not argue with him, as was her custom. Her man was young. That was a fact, but always very sensible. If he said so, there was some truth in it, however strange. He had also announced to her parents 6 months ago, in the same cavalier manner. Elizabeth and I love each other, and that's forever. We'll quarrel a little at university, and then we'll get married. Our decision is not subject to appeal, so all arguments are canceled in advance. Both families lived modestly. Parents couldn't afford a separate place for their children. Therefore, at a general family meeting before the modest wedding, it was decided that Robert and Elizabeth would marry after the 3rd year of study, when the university begins training in a narrow professional profile. So they did. Further in their life, everything was very similar to the life of other families. They did not grab stars from the sky in material terms. At the end of their 5th year, Joan's firstborn was born. 3 years later, Catherine. Just like to write a classic saga, married, have produced 2 children, dreaming of a 3rd child. The search for women around Robert persistently continued. Even the boss of his mother's colleague laid her eyes on him, and his office hung his portrait. He invited the door on the key immediately locked in his fashion attire. Shows of new collections of local tailoring sometimes happened. The place specialized in men's clothing. The walking mannequin was a left-handed kid. The catch was that the audience immediately recognized his unconventional orientation. The audience started laughing. And then Robert caught the eye of the businesswoman. We don't want such a nature to go to waste. And we don't want such a nature to go to waste. Young man only dress up, and the butterflies will no longer choose suits for clients, and this miracle to admire. Catch a Guy decided to catch a high fee, which intended to also include services of a personal nature for herself and defile on the runway for business. When I told Robert the salary, he couldn't believe his ears. What kind of accomplishments? You offer me a salary 5 times more than my mother, a seamstress with vast experience. The woman once again assessed him from head to toe. You seem like a big boy, bigger than some. I don't need to explain it to you. If you are obedient, I will buy you an apartment, a car, fancy rags, accessories. I will take you to restaurants and hotels. I will teach you to have an elite vacation at the seaside. You'll travel with me a couple times a year. Isn't that a tempting prospect? I think you misunderstood me. Robert removed her hand. I'm not the one to make that kind of offer. Find yourself another easygoing boy, and don't let my refusal to get back at my mother make you regret it. The incident was over. The lady didn't bother him anymore. After her, there was a smashing master of men's haircuts. She kept trying to press up against him during the process of fighting with his unruly hair. He was so accustomed for his short life to such outbursts from the female sex that he never paid any attention to them. Nor were the pretenders to his heart offended. He was too good-looking. It's a sin to be angry with such a man. Robert, even in the university, disappointed in applied physics. It wasn't the way he'd envisioned it at school. All the 4th and 5th year in the evenings he went, as if on the 2nd shift, to the liquor factory to work part-time. They just loaded the finished product for shipment to the regions, and they lived in a rented apartment. There was a new monetary unit, 1 gun, or 1/2 liter for stronger drinks. Jokes are jokes, but Jennifer and Robert themselves were indifferent to alcohol. But they used it actively as gifts to a plumber for replacing a faucet, to an electrician for repairing the wiring. Robert was constantly missing at work. During the day he worked as a design engineer at a machine building plant, and in the evenings a loader. Jennifer sat with the children, smoothly transitioning from one maternity leave to another. She had not yet applied her talents in economics. They lived amicably. Robert got along with his wife's parents, Jennifer with his parents. The usual family unit. That seemed to be the end of their story. But would fate let them go without a trial? They were waiting for a loving couple. And what a couple. The attack of severe pain in his back caught Robert in the evening. It was a cold winter at home. He was still working at the liquor factory. Times were tough. Although Jennifer had put her eldest son in kindergarten, the younger Catherine constantly demanded attention and was often unreasonably cranky. It was impossible to go outside with her in cold weather. Pulling pain with periodic sharp jabs in the area of the spine forced the man to go to the doctors. There he first heard a new word that became a diagnosis: hernia. As he understood from the doctor's words, it was about problems with the spine and discs. The doctors assured him that if he took care and did not lift heavy weights, everything would be fine with constant monitoring. He would live happily ever after. So Robert had to say goodbye to loading and unloading for now, a source of money. The financial situation of the family is somewhat shaken, and Catherine has not outgrown childhood colds, constantly either sniffling or coughing. District pediatrician strongly advised to take the girl in the summer to the sea, preferably for a couple of months. Otherwise, she would also be sick at school. Elizabeth, of course, found it impossible to go to the sea with only one daughter. It was out of the question financially to have a vacation with the four of them. The solution was to choose the lesser of two evils. Go to the sea with the three of us and the children. Robert somehow in 2 months will get out to them at least for a weekend. That's how the three of them went to the more or less democratic Anapa. Robert stayed home to do chores. Since some time a new tenant had settled in their house, a woman in her 40s, the owner of several clothing stores in the city. She moved into an apartment in a remote neighborhood, she said, so that the eyes of her husband after a high-profile divorce did not see her. The clever husband tried to sue half of the business from her, and the case with boutiques she created and developed herself. As she liked to quote the hero of the movie, Ivan Vasilievich changes profession by hard labor. Andrei and the yard-bright lady immediately noticed, and he seemed to her so flawless that she immediately wanted to participate in his fate. She invited him to work for her. Engineer, physicist, and fashionable business, two parallel planes. But surprisingly, he did well. His machine-building plant was living its last days. The technological lines were obsolete. No one, not even the most talented designer, could come up with anything ingenious to get this enterprise back on its feet. And the neighbor needed an assistant with decent looks, who could charm the partners with charisma and impeccable manners. Robert was perfect for this role. As for his wife, she just needed a deputy with an ideal reputation as a model family man. Her chain of stores was called Family. It stood for 7 friendly eyes. They sold clothes for men and women, as well as for children. Michael was very skeptical of her suggestion. He laughed, "Where am I with my technical education? And where are the clothes, new collections, all this glitter and tinsel of rags and accessories?" Jacqueline, on the other hand, was not so adamant. "Michael, do you underestimate yourself? Each of us should be willing to sell what we have in abundance. In your case, it's God-given beauty, so why not turn it into a popular commodity for the sake of your well-being? Let's just give it a try. A month's work with me won't cost you anything." He walked home and thought wistfully, nothing will come of this collaboration. She will again start looking for ways to get closer to me. And for me, such an option is impossible. The man was wrong. Jacqueline was a much wiser and more astute woman. She already had a young and strong companion for her health, but he was not smart enough to be seen with him in public, and her firm needed a male face. She used herself as a female face. What was missing was an idyllic image, an assistant with an impeccable reputation. Michael agreed to the experiment. Especially at the factory, everyone was on leave without pay for an indefinite period of time. Time was passing. Soon his family would return from the sea, and the house was empty. He couldn't make any money while his loved ones were improving their health on the coast. Jacqueline taught him the science of being, not appearing to negotiate patiently, to watch his speech, to dress tastefully even for a little money, to be able to maintain a conversation on any topic. She persistently dragged him along to all business meetings and brought him into her circle. After a couple of weeks, Michael calmed down. Jacqueline did not make any attempts. She diligently molded him into an enterprising business partner who is not lost in any commercial situation, will calculate ahead of all the moves, will increase the accumulated, save previously achieved. When Elizabeth returned home, she did not recognize Robert. At the train station, they were met by a respectable man in a strict, elegant suit, matching shirt, stylish tie. From surprise, she could not restrain irony. Where did such a handsome uncle come from? Then she rushed towards him and hung on her lover's neck. "No, you told me, of course, that you changed your job. But I could not imagine that the change in you would be so radical." At home, in a clean apartment, Elizabeth and the children were waiting for a set table, new toys, items of clothing, bought by the head of the family as a gift. It would be a happy life. But insidious envy is always around. In a barrel of honey finds a spoonful of tar. The range of Robert's duties included not only labor everyday life, but also accompanying the owner of the stores, Jacqueline, to corporate events held in her company and at the enterprises of colleagues in the trade. For some time now, Jacqueline had been obsessed with the idea of expanding the chain with 2 new department stores. She suddenly wanted families to be able to shop in her facility entirely without leaving the buildings and retail space. She was already negotiating for furniture. But even that didn't seem enough for her. In her dreams, she saw people coming into her realm for the day. In addition to non-food items, peeking into retail outlets with a large assortment of high-end products from farmers and private owners. Then it's off to a cafe, a pastry shop to celebrate successful purchases with drinks and sweets. She even found such a chef that she believed in success in advance. His handmade cakes and pastries were amazing. Even adherents of eternal diets could not resist and sat down at the table with everyone. The business promised to be very profitable and promising. Only one obstacle hindered these endeavors. An official from the city administration did not want to put her signature on the authorization documents for operation. She was an impenetrable old-school aunt, with no visible weaknesses. Jacqueline went all out, pulling in all her connections. But the case was stalled. Robert's boss was quite desperate, but then she learned a thing that made her hair stand on end. It turns out that the Iron Lady secretly liked to play, went to neighboring cities to indulge her passion for gambling away from the prying eyes of fellow countrymen. Moreover, she was very fortunate in this vice of hers. The owners of gambling houses were afraid of her appearance. Luck did not leave her for long, constantly increasing her secret capital, but no one tried to prevent her. After all, Madame was from the highest echelon of power at the local level and could close gambling establishments with a single movement of the hand. Having learned such sensational news, Jacqueline immediately decided to give Robert a delicate assignment. She will hire a private detective to find out what kind of places this lady likes to visit. Robert will casually get acquainted with her and try to get dirt in the form of photos and videos of her game. Yes, it wasn't the most ethical way to get the lady to back off. Jacqueline didn't like it herself. But what else was there to do? In the fight against the enemy, all means are good, even such a sneak attack. The preparations for the operation went smoothly. For a good fee, the secretary of the administrative lady leaked the information that she had taken a few days of vacation at work at her own expense. All indications were that she was going on a trip to one of the cities where she could indulge in gambling. After tracing where the train tickets had been bought, Robert was sent on a business trip. He only joked. "You've made a commercial spy out of me? You've got addresses, passwords, where to go and who to introduce myself as. The only thing left to do is to glue on a mustache and a beard for conspiracy. And then we can go on the job." One thing he didn't tell anyone. Robert took home all his savings, saved for a rainy day, to try his luck next to his lucky aunt. Moreover, he borrowed a large sum from the head of security at Jacqueline's office. It never occurred to anyone that he was playing with his luck, and he'd had a large drink of whiskey at the bar beforehand. Robert sat at the table next to the lady from the administration and was terribly angry. She bet on one number or the other, chose black or red color, and almost always won at least a small amount of money. He, on the other hand, lost every last dime. All the promises of beginner's luck turned out to be nothing, and he was never lucky. The waiter kept bringing him whiskey on the rocks. His head was getting heavier and heavier. He had forgotten all about his mission. At some point, his patience broke. He rose abruptly from the table, pushing away the waiter who was just about to pour him another drink. With a hard look at his lucky neighbor, he shouted, "Fuck you and your administrative capabilities. I'm here almost in my underpants camera carried to film you at the game, and you do not give a damn. It's all ha 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 until you've had enough." It was a scandal. Security instantly searched it and found hidden cameras and recorders. The official threw the money and instantly disappeared from the hall, not forgetting to grab the winnings. Jacqueline could not forgive Robert for the failure of the operation. That powerful lady couldn't. With some inner instinct, she realized who was so interested in collecting dirt on her. Jacqueline's dream of creating a nice shopping and entertainment centers crumbled into small shards. Now, when she met Robert in the yard, she didn't even say hello, deliberately averting her face. Robert came home like a beaten dog. The family piggy bank was empty. A servant from Jacqueline's entourage hinted to him that he would not wait long for the loan to be repaid. He would soon put him on the meter and follow him everywhere. At the machine factory, where Robert had a small position, they were not going to start the lines. Thoughts swirled in his head that his ex-wife was wrong. Where to sell beauty if no one in this world wants it? Only at the distillery did he have all the peace and serenity. Maybe he is weak, worthless head of the family, not capable of anything in this life. By all accounts, it appeared that his only dignity, loyalty, and devotion to his beloved woman. But he had nothing to feed her and the children. His feet carried him to the glass rows of vodka and liquor bottles. Where he had worked before, he could be useful. Why, his back was aching by evening, and he would bear it. His wife needn't know how he earned every penny. Soon tales are told and deeds are done. Usually within 2 years of working at the liquor factory, the family's financial situation has improved. Son Joan and daughter Catherine already went to school. Elizabeth found a job as a cashier in a small company. The salary was meager, but she could pick up her children after school, take them to classes, feed them at home properly, and check their lessons without rushing. The globe was spinning on its axis. The years went by slowly. The next bright burst in the career of 30-year-old Robert happened as if by magic. Apparently, the heavens took pity on his monotonous, like Groundhog Day, life. By that time, he had not bothered to find a more decent job. He remained infantile and uninitiative in this respect. He had little faith that there would be any change in his professional destiny. Elizabeth was tired of convincing him that Jacqueline's education and his looks could have been a good match for him. But he had been dealing with money debts for so long that he had always avoided any career opportunities, as if they were the hot milk of failure, potentially shaking his temporary well-being. Further events unfolded as follows. Robert's home liquor company began bottling a new line of elite liqueurs. In such cases, one cannot do without advertising, which the management did. In one of the pleasant spring days, the factory yard was filled with unusual noise. A commotion began. A crowd of curious people gathered. It's not every day that a real movie is shot in front of your eyes, a whole series of reels. Rumor has it that even billboards will be prepared. See how the bosses have splurged, whispered in the crowd. The workers must have had high hopes for those chocolate and coffee liqueurs. They're too sweet for us, too sweet, too sweet. They say they're aristocratic drinks for the ladies. But for us, it's all the same, as long as the advance payment and wages are paid on time. To the surprise of the audience, an ugly scene played out right in front of their eyes. Some actor of the local theater suddenly got into a pose and began to argue with the director and cameraman. Why didn't you tell me at once that you had to present ladies' goods? This you spoil my whole image of brutality, my reputation as a macho on stage and on the screen. Find him among the workers, someone with a face, and shoot him on your billboards. What kind of whimsy is that? Echoed him in the tone of a confused director. Where will I find a suitable texture here? They all have matchstick faces. Well, how with such a hot drink? It's a Klondike to work next to them. The workers looked at each other resentfully. The sight was no longer languid, and they immediately became offended. You insult us, my man. You insult us, my man. Our beauties have their own glamour. Your acting is no match for his. There he is. Robert was passing by on his way to the dining room for lunch. He never liked noisy spectacles, so he tried to stay away from the performance organized by advertising specialists at the factory. But curiosity, as always, won out. The director was a master of shooting commercials. They could use an extra, even a popular model with a fresh face. The reality exceeded all his expectations. Past the improvised set was such a handsome man of 35 years that the director in the first moments dumbfounded. then quickly pulled himself together and asked to follow him and sprint. It would be a big mistake to miss such material. "A man? Yes, you, I'm talking to you. Could you slow down a bit? I can't keep up with you," he said. "To what do I owe?" Robert stared at him with his impossible blue eyes. "I don't have such a long lunch break, and there are long lines in the cafeteria." The director looked him over once more from head to toe. Oh, what a good-looking man. His breed, his manners, his impeccable masculine figure, his correct facial features, seasoned with charisma. He was ready to pinch himself on the arm. Such Hollywood standards with snow-white teeth can't just walk around an old-fashioned distillery unperturbed. "Yes, he doesn't seem to know the price of his appearance," thought the director, and said aloud, "Would you agree to help us out?" Inner instinct of advertising business master for some reason immediately realized that to promise this man a golden mountain from the jump is not worth it. Here it is necessary to press on pity, to emphasize the failure of deadlines, on friendship and mutual assistance, to tell about the deadlocked situation with the actor suddenly refusing to shoot, as in the water looked. At first, Robert did not want to hear about any filming, heartily laughed in response to compliments of his beauty and relevance. "I have already once tried to sell my appearance as a marketable commodity. Nothing good came out of it. Somehow I do not want to go again in such experiments." "Do not chop from the shoulder," tried to press on the pity of the director. "If we had not had unforeseen circumstances, I would not have persuaded you now. You'd be a great help to us if you'd agree to do at least a billboard movie." Robert shuddered when he heard the amount of the fee he was being offered. The director decided not to be stingy, not to save money on a debutante. The man thought that this amount could be enough for a small trip to the sea for the four of us. Soon summer vacations. The children could use such an opportunity. 2 weeks later, huge billboards were hung all over the city, on which Robert drank liquor with the lady of his heart. Her role in the photo was played by a young student of the theater school, pretty as a rosebud in her youthful charm. Both looked at each other with such love, holding shot glasses of chocolate liqueur, that there was no doubt. There it was, the cause of the romantic mood lurking at the bottom of the elegant vessels. Sales of the liquor increased dramatically. The director rubbed his hands and waited for the release of commercials. In them, the sweet couple also starred brilliantly. He was very pleased with the photo, talent, and unexpected ability of Robert not to look in the frame stiff. That's the kind of guy the camera loves. After the launch of the videos, Robert began to be recognized on the street, and the products of the factory began to be ordered to other regions. Women looked at the colorful picture and demanded that their men urgently try the magic drink. The fees of 2 random models increased many times over. In the office of the director, more and more often began to hear phone calls. Rising star, shown in a successful commercial, suddenly urgently needed and his colleagues. But he firmly kept the situation under control, took on the production of commercials advertising men's perfume, and then sportswear. Before, Robert faced a dilemma to stay to work as a loader at his native distillery, or to listen to the advice of the new boss and go into the advertising business. The scale was outweighed by a vacation. This time they were able to go on vacation, all 4 of them. Elizabeth and the children were over the moon. Robert even stopped paying attention to more and more often arising in his back pain, until he did not disrupt another shooting. He went to the hospital with a severe attack of intervertebral hernia. Life apart from him flowed in its own way. Good they were now, as they call it, with money, could afford to undergo a medical examination in a private clinic. The doctor's conclusion this time was not so rosy. His work as a loader had done its job. His professional trauma had turned into a herniated disc. Robert had to spend a month in the clinic. Through the efforts of therapeutic exercise, drips, and skillful actions of the medical staff, doctors brought him back into action. Before discharge, they admonished him forget forever about heavy physical exertion, even medium, sharp movements of the body. Otherwise, next time you will find yourself right on the operating table. The verdict was final, not subject to appeal. The director met his favorite with open arms. The man no longer worked for him on the Bird's rights of the model, which occasionally invited to revitalize some video. Unexpectedly, Robert once proposed an innovative technical idea, then the next. Now he not only starred in his, at first, seemingly fantastic developments based on the laws of applied physics, but also came up with more and more new solutions. After he was hospitalized, the company somehow drastically reduced its management, drew conclusions. It was time to offer their talented generator of ideas a solid place in the executive chair. In the active labors on the advertising field, Robert did not even notice how the whole 5 years flew by. Joan has already had time to finish school. There was another significant event from a clumsy teenager. Resembling an ugly duckling, he suddenly turned into a copy of his father. Only his eyes were gray, huge, like Elizabeth's. History repeated itself. The guy was adored by all the classmates and girls from other schools, except that he didn't have his dad's stamina for attention from the female sex. He changed girlfriends like gloves, broke hearts carelessly, in passing, often forgetting the names and appearance of casual companions for one night. Robert and Elizabeth only had their heads in their hands. Joan heeded none of their exhortations. Preds. What do you know, honestly? I don't care how many girls I've had and how many more I'll have. They hang on me in bunches. Why should I deny myself the pleasure? I'm not going to go to school like you. I've already chosen the advertising department, which trains PR managers. I'll approach my dad's current business with more modern technology. But if I'm also invited to do a movie, it'll only be better. Fame will find its hero, or heroes. Joan wasn't your typical narcissist. At first he was shocked that so many members of the fair sex follow him in droves. He laughed I should take another shower. Is it in the maternity hospital? Or is it smeared for them he was bombarded in social networks with offers, and in real-life notes and invitations to parties and picnics, youth parties and nightclubs, or to his home? Times have changed, he told his parents. You're like mammoths. Your views on fidelity, no cheating, are outdated. Robert and Elizabeth did not push him too much, did not bring him up, did not hurry him to settle down, to meet his one and only woman. Let him go out for the time being. It's a young thing, they decided. They were now much more concerned about an unexpected problem that loomed on the horizon. Their daughter Catherine had just turned 15. It was time to think about her future profession. The girl's mind was filled with illusions and fantasies. She decided to become an actress and went to the theater club for the second year. Last week, a friend of the teacher, who works as a choirmaster, unexpectedly came to the class. She was interested in Catherine, who was performing a simple song from the play at the rehearsal. The woman was impressed by her voice and took her parents' contacts. Later she found Robert and Elizabeth, met with them, and was shocked by the news. Your girl has an extraordinary, rare vocal gift. I listened to her in detail after that chance meeting. It would be a crime if you didn't give her music and vocal training. Who knows? Maybe we're looking at a future great opera singer. Robert and Elizabeth stared at her. Yes, the choral specialist nodded. You heard right. Your daughter has a unique voice which now looks like a rough diamond that will become a magnificent diamond. But Catherine is already 15 years old, Elizabeth said thoughtfully. Isn't it too late for her to learn music and singing? The choirmaster smiled slyly. It's never too late to become a singer, or to learn anything at all. It's strange that you didn't notice that your daughter has such a beautiful voice. Yes, singing never really stood out in front of them. Robert tried to explain his ignorance. Only at matinees in kindergarten, and later her singing I will not remember. The girl saw her vocation in another, remembered herself in the theater, in the cinema as an actress, hastened to dispel his doubts. Woman, And the decision, of course, you. But if I were you, I would buy a piano without delay and devote all her free time to vocal lessons. I'll find the necessary specialists for such a gifted child. I look forward to your call. The piano for Katrin was bought the following week. It's expensive and very beautiful. It's beautiful to look at and play on. Robert personally supervised the loading and unloading of the instrument. He was afraid that the movers would do something wrong. On the platform of the third floor, it seemed to the man that the workers were about to drop their purchase. What's holding this enormous thing on its sides? It's awkward, unstable, he thought. Robert lunged forward, picked up the piano from the side so it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, and immediately slid to the floor. His eyes went black with pain, and he could hardly move. The movers frightenedly surrounded the client. One of them rushed to the 5th floor to call Elizabeth. The ambulance arrived quickly. At the hospital, the doctors only shook their heads. Too rapid turn of the body, trying to pick up a heavy instrument, did their job. Robert's condition could only be improved by surgery, for which the man immediately began to prepare. It was entrusted to a young, ambitious surgeon, Madison. Already in an hour, she came to get acquainted with her new patient and froze. He was so handsome. Madison, as is often the case in academic and career circles, had shown great promise since medical school. Her father was a brilliant surgeon, and her mother was an equally savvy operating gynecologist. The girl was already accustomed from childhood in the house to constant medical conversations and discussions. Other future as to join the family dynasty, for herself did not see. Personal life, at a rather pretty young woman, did not add up. Robert and Madison were a college couple who had married hastily, but soon divorced after a few carefree relationships. By the age of 30, Madison was left with a bad experience and a burning desire to make things right. She fell in love with Robert at first sight. He scheduled the surgery in 5 days. Madison went to work on her residency in confusion. She had a picture in front of her eyes, snow-white bedding, dark hair with barely visible sagebrush on the pillow, and startling blue eyes filled with pain. She'll make this man smile and forget his ailment. Or is she not a first-rate surgeon? And then there's his wife, Jacqueline, who's always getting underfoot. A gray mouse with big gray eyes. What could they possibly have in common? After all, they'd been living together for quite a while. The grown children came to visit their father. Madison grinned wryly. Can't push the wife away. I'm on night duty tomorrow. I'll take the bull by the horns as soon as my patient starts thinking and feeling better after the anesthetic. That day and the next seemed endless to her. She ran to Robert under any pretext, touched his forehead with a cool palm, listened to his lungs for some reason. The patient was indifferent to all her manipulations, reviving only when his wife appeared in the room. Nothing, my darling, Madison thought. You don't know yet what a surprise I've prepared for myself. By evening the next day, the surgical ward was nearly empty by evening. Elizabeth was going home too. There were some things to be done there. Robert's surgery was coming up soon. After it, she would be with him 24 hours a day for the first time. The children's meals have to be cooked, the house cleaned, the laundry done. Robert is feeling a little better so far. Now all that's left is to get through the surgery. Madison waited until Robert was alone. When all was quiet, she went to his room, where he was alone. The man was dozing uneasily. She snuck under the covers to the patient. The man flinched in surprise and stared at her with uncomprehending eyes. What's going on here? How did you get here? What do you want? Robert asked excitedly. Relax, Robert, his doctor whispered in his ear in a different voice. I like you a lot. Too much. But Robert felt only rejection, squeamishness, disgust. Are you crazy, Madison? I didn't give you any preferential treatment. I didn't hint. I didn't seek your favor. I love and respect my wife Jacqueline too much to even have such thoughts. Such an invasion of his personal territory was beyond his moral comprehension. so he pressed the button to call the nursing staff. Soon a nurse appeared in the room, her eyes rounded at the scene she had uncovered. Madison was huddled like a snake in the restroom. The man was still looking around fearfully. After calming him down, the nurse snidely asked the doctor on duty, "Madison, do you need my help or can I go?" There was no response. The woman in the restroom remained silent. A little while later, she quietly walked out of there. Turning around, she gritted her teeth. "You'll remember this concert. No one has ever humiliated me like that." Passing by the post, the duty nurse could not help but notice the ironic smile of her colleague. Tomorrow the whole department would know about the night incident. Madison had no doubt about that. So she kept a low profile for the remaining days before the surgery. She kept thinking of one idea. Robert did not say a word, did not show anything that could arouse suspicion in his wife about the night incident. He didn't want to upset her with such trivialities. He was polite but cold to Madison. The day of the surgery was finally set for tomorrow. The meeting with the doctor had already taken place, only Elizabeth was a little nervous. After all, she hadn't sung for a long time, and tomorrow she had scheduled an extremely important meeting with 2 vocal teachers at once. Robert only laughed at Elizabeth's fears. "The surgery is elective, not the most complicated, while I'm under anesthesia on the table. You'll have just enough time to meet with everyone and talk things over," Robert said. "It's about the future of our daughter, Catherine. You have to be with me, and I'll be transferred to the intensive care unit first. You will come closer to the evening, when you have solved all the questions about the training of our young talent." That was the deal. Surgery to remove a herniated disc in the lumbar spine was not something unusual for Madison, so all her movements were honed to automaticity. She was a surgical professional who knew exactly what she could and could not do. Glimpse once again admiring the beautiful face of the patient, she gave the command to the assistants to serve something, bring something, and herself touched the nerve endings at the site of the operation so that no one noticed. In the protocol of manipulation of this nuance, Madison did not enter. After congratulating her colleagues on the end of the operation, she told the orderlies to bring Robert into the intensive care unit to observe the exit from anesthesia. A reaction to her experiment was to follow later. That was okay. She would wait. She was patient. At 3 a.m., she got a call from the ICU. "Madison, your patient is awake, but he can't feel his legs. Madison, come to us right away. We don't understand why there's such a serious complication." Stupid, the woman grinned to herself. "I paralyzed him on the operating table forever. But you will never know why he is paralyzed. That secret will go to the grave with me, because a woman cannot be cornered by unthinkable humiliation. No one dares to reject me, not even such a handsome man." Madison searched her soul diligently and found not a shred of pity for her patient. What's more, she only now remembered how she knew the man so well. He was the guy who'd graced billboards around town when her mom was into chocolate liquor. And her victim turns out to be a screen star. So much the worse for him. Now his business will be over. How weird is that? Didn't she take the Hippocratic Oath, which includes do no harm? Madison immediately answered herself, "I took an oath as a future doctor, and his nerve endings were touched by an offended woman. Now, your inviolable marriage, Mr. Plotnitsky, will you touch? I'll see how long it will take you both to portray the eternal, faithful to each other Tristan and Isolde." Meanwhile, Elizabeth was rushing to the hospital to Robert with good news. She had managed to arrange for piano and vocal lessons with both teachers. Already tomorrow, Catherine would begin to make up for lost time to prepare for admission to the music school. Her daughter was pleased. Joan was a parasite, he kept laughing. What a parasite. But it's going to happen. We now have our own Maria Callas or Montserrat Cabal in the family, he said, laughing. Then the three of them laughed contagiously, drank tea with scones and cherry jam, discussed that soon Robert would return, and life would go on as usual. Then the children went about their business, and Elizabeth hurried to Robert's house, remembering to bring some goodies for him. At the clinic, putting on a robe, the woman already approached her husband's room, where he was transferred from the intensive care unit. But then she heard the nurses whispering, "Lord, why should such a beautiful man be punished by God? I cleaned his floors, and he lies like a statue. Recently he was taken down from the intensive care unit. He can't feel half of his torso from below. What a grief for the family." Elizabeth's legs gave out and she flopped down on the couch. It can't be. What are they saying about Robert? That there are no other handsome men in the hospital. He's the only one having surgery today. Her head rumbled, soothing thoughts. But the heart couldn't lie. It knew the truth, and it bled like a wounded animal. Something had gone wrong for her husband Robert today. Fate had handed down a sentence that could not be reversed. Robert's condition had not changed a bit in a day, a month, or a year. During that time, he and Elizabeth had gone through several stages of acceptance. First, the man was in sullen despair, then in prostration, then in anger at the circumstances. He shouted at Elizabeth, "You must leave me. It is not proper for a woman of 40 to sleep in a cold bed. You realize I'm not a man anymore." Elizabeth reacted to his outbursts in different ways. She cried or, on the contrary, laughed, said that this is nothing, that this is not the main thing in the relationship between a man and a woman. She found new arguments for her husband. Robert, for a while, seemed to calm down. But inside he still did not agree with her, as it seemed to him, unnecessary devotion. He thought that she was burying her feminine nature, took on an impossible burden. He would surely figure out a way to free her from that heavy cross. Madison got off lightly at work. There was a meeting to analyze the actions of everyone involved in that unfortunate operation. Independent experts reviewed the entire protocol of the surgical procedure in detail. They found no medical errors. The patient's complications were attributed to his personal physiologic peculiarities. Madison continued to work in the department, even without a reprimand or reprimands in her file, as if nothing had happened. Only the nurse on duty that night, when the surgeon unusually visited Robert's room, suddenly decided to change her job. She found a position as head nurse on Madison's father's ward. Such a happy coincidence. The girl was smart, and she wouldn't talk about what she'd seen. Only Madison hinted that it was strange how everything with the patient turned out, at the right time in the right place. She didn't have a problem with it. All the more reason for her to feel like she'd overstayed her welcome in the ranks. A nurse with her experience would like to find a bigger position. The two women, Elizabeth and Jacqueline, understand each other and agree. Not long after the heated scandals and Robert's attempts to talk Elizabeth into a divorce, their home became suspiciously quiet and calm. The man was increasingly digging with some blueprints, inventing something. At work in an advertising company, given his early merits, such trouble was left for him. The place of a freelance technical development consultant was formalized on a remote mode and faithfully paid a small allowance called salary. Elizabeth was still working in her small firm, but as an economist. The salary was low, and her savvy helped. Back when Robert was in favor, smiling at everyone from every other billboard in town, she saved some money, put it in the bank for a long time at a fairly high interest rate. There was enough for bread and butter, and even sometimes their favorite blackcurrant jam. With entertainment, Catherine had to temper her appetite a little. But the children loved their father so much that they took it for granted, so there were no serious material worries in the family. After a couple of months of hard work, Robert asked Elizabeth to invite his colleague Michael to dinner. He explained that he and Michael have long had a warm friendship, so he wants to ask him to help with the launch of a new invention in the shooting of commercials. We had a good time. We recalled funny incidents from the life of the native company. Michael lamented that the face of the advertising kingdom could disappear from the screen. and then Long asked Robert to take one and another pose. He gave his resume later. My profession as a cameraman taught me to shoot people in a variety of angles. You've become even more photogenic, Robert. There's something in your eyes. So now we have to base our commercials on your close-ups. It'll be an even bigger success, I guarantee it. Michael was not the least bit mistaken. Advertising office furniture, in which Robert filmed in a huge office improvised boss, the public was accepted by the hurrah. Respectable and dressed with needle, a very handsome man with intelligent eyes created the image of an ideal boss who wants to obey unconditionally. And no one needed to know how to shoot immobilized Robert, laying cushions in the high luxurious chair of a modern manager. After the first experience began to appear other orders. Former magnitude in them was not, but decent money for the family to earn quite well received. Robert, as before, came up with some interesting additions to the technical equipment of the situation in the frame. Everything together made their commercials in demand on the advertising market. Elizabeth breathed a little sigh of relief that her husband had abandoned his idea that they should get a divorce. At least he wasn't having any more unpleasant conversations on the subject. Robert was troubled by something else. After that dinner at their home, he noticed with what sympathy Michael is interested in his wife's affairs, secretly asking him how she is doing. Goes casually on the street when Elizabeth comes to pick up Robert from the shooting. A slightly wild plan was growing and solidifying in Robert's mind. He decided to let his wife go so she could live life to the fullest again. For the cause took zealously, and became even closer to the handsome cameraman, and began to often invite him to the house. On various far-fetched occasions encouraged his attention to his wife. A woman's heart is not a stone. Elizabeth, who had long been ignorant of other people's attention from cavaliers, was susceptible to Michael's behavior. He carried flowers, candy, and fruit to her every time, as if he were courting her. When was the last time she had a date in her life? Over 20 years ago, and now she was living in a cocoon of constant moral fatigue. No, she thought. I have not fallen out of love with my dear Robert. I have always been faithful to him. But sometimes one wants spring in one's soul so much. It is so hard to give up its blooming signs that promise joy. Robert at all these meetings between the three of them was as unperturbed as an iceberg. He pretended not to see that around him hovering love vibes from Michael, and Elizabeth is often embarrassed and does not know how to behave. Moreover, when the advertising company has a loud corporate party, he suddenly said he was sick, complaining of severe back pain. When Michael began to persuade Elizabeth not to miss such an interesting event, suddenly came to life, fussed, began to prove to his wife that she must have fun this evening. And then only supermarkets, pharmacies, nowhere to go. At the party, where for once Elizabeth dressed up in her best cocktail dresses, no one cared about her and Michael. People were enjoying champagne and stronger drinks, snacking from baskets, salad boxes, and desserts. Elizabeth and Michael did a lot of dancing. Elizabeth felt a little dizzy. How long had it been since she'd had a close relationship? A year? 2, 3? She had already lost count, trying never to think about it. After a soulful evening, they didn't take a cab. They decided to take a short walk along the promenade. Elizabeth soon got cold, so Michael threw his jacket over her shoulders and tried to hug her. She rejected his attempt. This conversation is not working, Michael thought. I love you, Elizabeth. Suddenly, Michael took a firm step toward her. I realize I shouldn't be having this conversation with you. You're married, and Robert is my companion. From the outside, my confession seems mean to someone who is not quite healthy, but I can't help it. I am drawn to you with such force that I am losing my head. Elizabeth was embarrassed by his confession, but answered him honestly. The worst part of it all is that I like you too. I wouldn't call it love, but you touched some strings in my feminine soul. Michael looked hopefully into her eyes. Shall I take your answer to mean that I have a chance to win your favor? Let's switch to you after all. I think we can leave all this superfluous ceremony behind already. Elizabeth answered slowly, as if considering something. We'll certainly transition to you easily. That's not the point, Elizabeth replied. You have to understand, Michael, Robert is my life, my only man, the father of my children, my soul and my heart. Right now, I may have the beginnings of a simple desire. I'm alive. But I'm not going to cheat on my husband. He and I are what they call, for better or for worse, let our heads sit on the same pillow, like Robert's. He's already gone gray since his surgery. I'm not arguing with that either. I'm just covering up the gray that's coming in so he won't see it. Think about it. Do you want a woman like me? Is it worth loving me and wasting precious time of your life? Michael was more serious than ever. All remnants of the champagne he'd drunk at the party were gone. I'll wait, Elizabeth, as long as it takes for you to realize how you really feel about me. I won't even remind you of that, but you should know that at any hour of the day or night, the doors of my bachelor pad are open to you. Let you not confuse that I am 7 years younger, that I have never been married, that having no experience in family life, I will learn everything quickly if next to me will be a woman like you. Then they were silent most of the time at home. Everyone was thinking about his own things. They didn't want to talk. Elizabeth didn't know what to do. Should she tell her husband that Michael had confessed his love to her, that he had promised to wait for her if she decided to leave Robert? She decided against it. She never said a word about that conversation. Michael decided otherwise. He decided to have a frank talk with Robert because he doesn't want to do anything behind his back. He considers it dishonest. He will ask his comrade to let his wife be happy and let her go to another man. That is, to him. Stalling for an explanation, he would not. There was too much at stake for himself. He was not really an ardent bachelor, had on the male account of a womanizer dozens of short-lived novels. But his heart was silent. As a professional cameraman, he could spot beauty, distinguish artificial grimaces. He fell in love with Jennifer like an inexperienced boy. The imperfect figure of the not young girl excited him so much that after meeting Jennifer for a long time, he could not calm the rapid pulse. She wasn't a fan of makeup. Her childishly naive gray eyes were without a single dab of mascara. He thought that was even better. He didn't see any flaws or imperfections in her, didn't notice what she was wearing today. All he cared about was her mood and her condition. Did she feel good? Was she not too tired? When they found themselves alone without her husband at the corporate ball, he felt like he was on a date with a woman for the first time in his life. Everything he'd had before her had been erased from his soul, from his memory. He was starting his life with a clean slate in matters of communication with the opposite sex. Only this way, not the other way around. The moment he pulled off his jacket and threw it over Jennifer's frozen back, he decided for himself that it was now or never, but he had to talk to her. He had an acquaintance who worked at the clinic where Robert had been operated on, so he knew the whole situation. His chosen one, his Jennifer, should be living life to the fullest. She's only a little over 40. It's a crime against her life. That's what fate had decreed. The conversation between Michael and Robert took place 3 days later. In the living room, two destinies, two contenders for happiness, in love and in love for many years, came together, a cripple and a healthy, strong man, a man who had lost all hope and a man who was very much hoping for happiness. They did not shirk. They were honest with each other to the end. "I love her more than life," Michael asked. "Let her go, she can still be happy. I offered her a divorce when I found out about my diagnosis and future prospects," Robert explained. "She wouldn't leave. Let her decide for herself." They parted not as enemies, not as friends. Before they did, they called Elizabeth and told her that they had had such a difficult but honest conversation. She suddenly took offense. "I'm not a thing. Why are you dividing me behind my back and without telling me? Elizabeth said. Michael replied that it was Robert's will. He explained that he didn't want to cause her any unnecessary pain. It was so confusing, so frightening. The circumstances proposed for the three of them were not impossible. They could even be called quite civilized. But that didn't make it any easier for their trio. No one yet understood what the decision of a woman who was loved by two worthy men would be. For several days, everything in Robert's house was as if no sharp, momentous proposals had come from Michael. The man himself had gone quiet somewhere, never showing his face. Elizabeth fiddled with the daily chores and paid even more attention to caring for her husband, but was mostly suspiciously silent. Joan's downfall. Another stormy affair, and yet another piece of news rocked them. He was offered to star in a commercial, also to be the face of the company, but a youthful one. He was bursting with pride. "I am also handsome and will soon appear on the first billboards in the city," he said. His father, having listened to his enthusiastic story about his first successes, cooled his ardor a little. "Son, beauty has two sides. My mother and I still turn a blind eye to the endless round dance of your girls. But at some point you'll have to stop, settle down, choose the one you want to live with for the rest of your life." Joan retorted, "Dad, you're talking like you're in the last century. Love is one woman for life. Do you believe in these fairy tales? Even though you and Mom have been together for more than 20 years, you have an ironclad certainty that it will always be like that." Robert shivered. He didn't have that certainty right now. He didn't know. What if Elizabeth still wanted to try a different kind of happiness? These thoughts were slowly making him mad. And yet, he loved her so much that he was willing to let her go. A woman shouldn't have to give up on herself. The atmosphere in the apartment was a little annoying to Catherine. She spent the whole day right after school disappeared at music lessons, and then at home sang romances, which she now passed with the teacher at the top of her voice. Lines from a gorgeous piece were now being sung, touching the notes of romance in her soul. Elizabeth was washing dishes in the kitchen and thought wistfully, "Everything feels like it's pushing me toward Michael. Or maybe I'm looking everywhere for signs, pointers." I sometimes shuddered at the memory of that evening. I couldn't lie to myself. The dilemma: how to move on. After a conversation between the two men who love her, circumstances, as always, pushed her to the denouement. The video with her husband in the lead role took first place in a contest of advertising products. To receive the award had to be not anywhere, but in Chicago. That's where the competition was held, regional companies. With this news, Michael again appeared in their house, enthusiastic, handsome, with hope in his burning eyes. "Robert, Elizabeth, this is such a success, such heights. You and I must go to Chicago for this prestigious award. I will help as much as possible to make the trip comfortable," he said. Robert's mind immediately thought, here it is, the one that will make all the difference. Elizabeth must go to Chicago with Michael without me. I will let her go at any cost. Robert was a little miffed that he did not have to persuade his wife to go to Chicago. He immediately considered it a bad sign for him, a harbinger of the separation that would follow the trip. He was engaged in an inner dialogue with himself. What did you really want? That she would voluntarily enroll as a nun. You haven't touched her in 3 years. Robert moved defiantly into the living room to the large upholstered sofa. Elizabeth was packing her suitcase. No closet antics, no special outfits. Leaning toward restraint. This will be a business trip. I'll just act as my husband's official representative and go straight home, she thought. But then why had she put her prettiest lingerie at the bottom of the suitcase? She'd stuffed the bottle of perfume in her pocket, the one Michael had said at the party that smelled so good. Had she already made up her mind, and was she just fooling men? But after all, in her heart is still no answer to the question that concerns them both: who will she choose? In Chicago, in order not to waste time, Michael and Elizabeth arrived by airplane. The events were designed for 3 days. They would also have the opportunity to walk around the city. At the hotel, their rooms were on opposite sides of the hallway, but on the same floor. Elizabeth quickly changed into comfortable jeans, sneakers, and a long sleeve. Screw all the dresses and high-heeled shoes. I only brought them for tomorrow's ceremony. Charming Michael is not part of my plan, she thought. They had dinner right in the hotel restaurant. There was neither the energy nor the desire to look for something else. Before, Michael and Elizabeth had not felt constrained in each other's company, but now it was as if they had a bond of silence. They did not speak, but stuttered on every word. "Do you like it? It's amazingly picturesque," Michael kept saying. His favorite place of power turned out to be a fenced area on the roof of a high-rise building with benches, tables, and even umbrellas from the sun, which were now rolled up. Tidy, cozy, unusual. On the walls, colorful drawings, graffiti. Now they were here alone amidst the city lights fading into twilight, and beneath them was all of Chicago in the palm of their hands. A mesmerizing sight. After drinking wine from a plastic cup, Elizabeth felt a sense of relaxation begin to blossom inside her for the first time. There was a beauty in the change of scenery, after all. Conversation was effortless now. Michael talked about his childhood, about his parents, who lived in a small town near Chicago. They loved their greenhouses, where they grew several unusual varieties of tomatoes. When fresh salad greens appeared on the table, there you could find fruits ranging in color from orange and yellow to black. Michael pulled Elizabeth to him, kissed her. She did not push him away as before, but responded to his kiss. "They like you," Michael said. "Who?" Jennifer didn't understand. "My parents," he explained. "They're very simple, but they're also very warm-hearted people. They'll be easy for you to be with." She didn't say anything against it. She couldn't forget his kiss. And he realized it in his gut. They went to his room in the hotel. After that sleepless night of awarding a statuette for the best work of her husband, as a model of commercials Elizabeth remembered as in a fog, then she and Michael had nothing to stop them from being together for 2 more days. The man thought triumphantly, "Elizabeth is mine now. She will now leave Robert for good." There can be no doubt about that. He did not ask her anything about it. He was absolutely sure. They flew home in silence. It seemed to him that there was a complete understanding between them. From the airport they went to his house. Hastily, in 4 hands, prepared dinner. Again they locked in a long embrace. They fell asleep in the morning. When Michael awoke, Elizabeth was gone. On the nightstand next to his bed was a note. "Michael, I'm sorry I'm a jerk because I only used you. I had to figure out, can I do it without Robert? The answer is no. You're a very good man. You're very gentle. But my heart tells me I don't love you and I never will. There's still only room for my husband. Thank you for everything." He didn't understand anything. He reread the text of the note, looked around once more. All of Elizabeth's things had disappeared from the bedroom. Would she go back to Robert again? Michael didn't kid himself. A woman like Elizabeth would indeed return to her husband, love him further, understanding everything, and endure the hardships associated with it. And the fact that she gave a temporary weakness, it is understandable. Elizabeth honestly told Michael that she was alive. He immediately added another epithet of his own, real. Michael immediately forgave her and, moreover, did not have any claims to her, did not think that she humiliated his male ego. Robert woke up reluctantly, out of inertia. He did not want to stay in this world. After all, Michael and Elizabeth were supposed to return home from New York yesterday. But Elizabeth never showed up. So she hadn't made her choice in his favor. Joan had gone to a sleepover at a friend's house last night, threatening to spend the whole weekend with her. And Catherine was getting some sleep after the recital. Robert sniffed his nose and thought how strange. The apartment smells like my favorite cheesecakes with raisins and vanilla. Is Catherine up at the crack of dawn and working in the kitchen? The man quickly pulled on sweatpants and a t-shirt, moved into his wheelchair, and drove to the smell of fried cottage cheese. In the kitchen, with his back to him, his Elizabeth was fiddling in a stretched homemade bright yellow t-shirt and black and white checked capri pants, his favorite. The boiling kettle whistled on the stove, so she didn't hear the sound of the stroller pulling into the kitchen. That's what a loving woman's heart is capable of. Like a barometer, it picks up any changes in the family atmosphere. Elizabeth instantly turned around and saw the happy blue eyes looking at her with mute adoration. She rushed to the man, knelt down, and embraced his motionless legs. "Can you forget and forgive me all that has happened during these 3 days of my absence?" Elizabeth asked. I could not resist. The native instinct of woman was stronger than my moral principles. "But I have learned the most important thing: there can be no other man on this earth and in the whole universe but you, and let only death separate us, but very soon." Tears flowed from Robert's eyes. He wasn't going to resent her. He loved her too much and wanted her to be happy. Even if not with him, but what happiness it was. His woman had chosen him again out of a million men, just as she had done then, more than 20 years ago. Could any new misfortunes ruin their love now? Michael asked her quietly. So, together again. And now forever? Elizabeth answered. Yes, only like that, only together, my love. At that moment, the honored Catherine came into the kitchen. Like her father before, she too was attracted by the curious aroma. "Mom, are you making your specialty cheesecakes?" she exclaimed. "I'm the first to taste." She reached for the ruddy curds on her plate, not even bothering to scoop Elizabeth's sour cream into her cup. "By the way, my dear parents, why are you at the movies this morning? It's not like we haven't seen each other in 3 or 4 days." "What a tragedy," said Catherine carelessly. Elizabeth thought to herself that a tragedy could have happened if she had made the wrong decision, and Robert could think of nothing at all. He had dissolved into his wife. How good life is, even in a wheelchair. You just have to realize it in time, appreciate it, feel it. Sometimes it's even possible to persevere through tough trials. He and Elizabeth did.